Somewhere beneath the endless green ceiling of the Amazon jungle, beneath centuries of tangled roots and rotting leaves and the accumulated silence of forgotten ages, there are cities. Not ruins in the way we typically imagine ruins, not scattered stones half buried in mud, not a crumbling wall here and a broken column there. No, there are entire urban landscapes down there. Streets, plazas, causeways stretching for miles between carefully engineered settlements. Pyramid structures rising above what were once the most densely populated regions on Earth, and for hundreds of years we walked right past them, we flew over them, we hacked through the vegetation surrounding them without ever knowing they were there. That is changing now, and what is being found is rewriting everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Over the past decade, a technology called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has done something that no explorer, no archaeologist, no satellite image could ever accomplish. It has looked through the jungle. It has stripped away the green canopy digitally, laser by laser, pulse by pulse, and revealed what lies beneath in extraordinary, breathtaking detail. The results have been shocking, not mildly surprising, not academically interesting in a quiet conference room kind of way. Shocking. The kind of shocking that makes veteran archaeologists, people who have dedicated their entire careers to understanding ancient civilizations, sit down and stare at their screens in disbelief. Because what LiDAR has shown us is not a collection of small tribal settlements scattered across the landscape. What it has shown us are cities. Enormous, sophisticated, carefully planned urban environments that rival anything built in the ancient world. Environments that suggest a level of social organization, engineering knowledge, and civilizational complexity that simply should not exist according to the timeline we have been taught. According to the timeline that has governed our understanding of human history for generations. And here is where things get truly extraordinary. Because the more we look in the Amazon, in the Yucatan, in the highlands of Bolivia, in the ancient deserts of the Sinai, in the mountains of Turkey, in the temples of Egypt, the more we find things that do not fit, objects that should not exist, structures that should not have been buildable with the tools we have assigned to the people who built them. Astronomical alignments that suggest a knowledge of the cosmos so precise, so mathematically sophisticated, that we struggle to replicate it even today. Artifacts manufactured using techniques that were not supposed to be invented for another 1,000 years. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, moved and placed with a precision that our best engineers look at and scratch their heads. What does it all mean? Where does it point? Is this simply a story about how much smarter and more capable ancient peoples were than we have given them credit for, or is it something more? Is there a thread running through all of these discoveries, through the jungle cities and the impossible temples and the out-of-place artifacts, that connects them to something even older, something even more profound, a chapter of human history, or perhaps pre-human history, that has been lost so completely that we have been living in its shadow without knowing it? That is what we are going to explore today. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to take you on a journey through the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the modern age. We are going to look at what LiDAR has found beneath the Amazon canopy. We are going to walk through the impossible engineering of Baalbek and Puma Punku. We are going to examine the ancient nanotechnology embedded in Roman glassware. We are going to descend into the underground labyrinth of Egypt's Serapeum and ask the questions that Egyptologists have been reluctant to answer. We are going to follow the story of the greatest explorer who ever disappeared, a man who gave his life searching for a lost civilization in the jungle, and ask whether he was right all along. And then we are going to go back even further, much further, to a time before the last ice age ended. To a period when the sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today, to a world that was home to something remarkable and to the catastrophe that destroyed it. Buckle up, because history, as you have been taught it, is about to get a great deal more complicated. Let us begin where it all starts, chronologically, in terms of the journey of discovery in the Amazon basin, specifically in the Llanos de Mojos, the vast tropical savanna that stretches across what is now northern Bolivia. This is not the dense jungle that most people picture when they imagine the Amazon. This is a mosaic landscape, patches of forest, open grasslands, seasonally flooded plains, and for a very long time archaeologists largely overlooked it. The assumption was that the Amazon in all its forms was simply too harsh an environment to have supported complex civilizations. The soil was too poor, the flooding too unpredictable, the resources too dispersed. It was a land, the thinking went, of small, mobile, simple societies. That thinking was wrong, completely, fundamentally, spectacularly wrong. The Casarabe culture, and when we say culture, we mean a society of remarkable sophistication, built something in the Llanos de Mojos that takes your breath away when you see it revealed by LiDAR imaging. When researchers from the University of Exeter and their collaborators pointed their aerial LiDAR sensors at the region and began processing the data, what emerged from the digital stripping away of vegetation was jaw-dropping. An urban settlement stretching across the landscape, a settlement with a clear, deliberate internal structure. A central mound, what archaeologists call a civic ceremonial center, rising above the surrounding terrain, surrounded by concentric rings of lower mounds connected by straight earthwork causeways. Around this central complex, a network of smaller mounds arranged in patterns that suggest residential neighborhoods. Agricultural fields carefully engineered to manage the seasonal floods, fish weirs, water management infrastructure of remarkable complexity. This was not a village. This was not even a town in the modest sense of the word. The Llanos de Mojos, as revealed by LiDAR, contained the remains of a genuinely urban civilization, one that, according to researchers, may have supported a population of tens of thousands of people. Some estimates have gone higher, and this civilization was thriving long before European contact, long before any outsider arrived to document or describe it. But here is what makes it even more extraordinary. This was not an isolated discovery. It was not a single exceptional site that stood out from an otherwise empty landscape. As researchers processed more and more LiDAR data from across the broader Amazon region, they found that the Casarabe settlements were not alone. They were part of a network, a regional system of interconnected urban centers linked by those engineered causeways, sharing a common architectural language, suggesting a common cultural and possibly political framework. About what that means. We are talking about a civilization, a genuine, complex urban civilization in the heart of the Amazon that we knew essentially nothing about until a few years ago. A civilization that built cities, managed landscapes, engineered water systems, and connected its settlements with what amounted to roads, all in a region we had written off as too harsh for complex human organization. The question this raises, immediately and urgently, is how many others are there? How many more cities are buried beneath the canopy elsewhere? The Amazon basin covers approximately 2.7 million square miles. The LiDAR surveys that have revealed the Casarabe settlements covered a tiny fraction of that area, a tiny fraction, and they found multiple urban centers, multiple settlement networks, multiple layers of civilizational complexity. If you extrapolate, and researchers are very careful to caution against extrapolating too aggressively, the implications are extraordinary. The Amazon may have been home to dozens, perhaps hundreds, of complex urban societies that have left no trace in our history books because the jungle swallowed them whole. Now let us be precise about what LiDAR is and how it works, because understanding the technology is crucial to understanding why these discoveries are only happening now and why they are happening with such sudden speed and force. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. At its core, it is a remote sensing technology that uses laser light to measure distances. A LiDAR sensor, typically mounted on an aircraft, though increasingly also on drones and satellites, fires billions of laser pulses at the ground below. Each pulse travels down through the air, and when it hits something, a leaf, a branch, the ground itself, it bounces back to the sensor. By precisely measuring the time it takes for each pulse to return, the system can calculate the distance to whatever the pulse hit. Do this billions of times, flying over a landscape, and you build up an extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional map of everything the lasers touched. Now here's the magical part for archaeology. Vegetation is not a solid wall to laser light. The pulses are fired so densely, so rapidly, that some of them inevitably find their way through gaps in the canopy, between leaves, between branches, through patches of open sky in the forest structure. And when they hit the ground, they bounce back and tell you exactly what the ground surface looks like, even if that ground is buried under 50 feet of forest canopy. By filtering out the returns that came from vegetation and keeping only the returns that came from the ground, researchers can generate what amounts to a bare earth model, a digital map of the ground surface as if the forest simply was not there. And when you look at a bare earth LiDAR model of the Amazon, or the Yucatan, or dozens of other heavily forested ancient landscapes, you see them. The shapes that do not belong to natural topography. The straight lines, because nature does not make perfectly straight lines over long distances. The regular geometric arrangements of mounds. The depressions that mark ancient reservoirs or sunken plazas. The raised causeways connecting one elevated area to another. The precisely rectangular or circular earthworks that can only be the work of human hands. All of it invisible to the eye from above, invisible to anyone on the ground, invisible to every satellite and aerial photograph ever taken, but perfectly, starkly visible to LiDAR. This is why the field of archaeology has been genuinely, profoundly transformed in the past 10 to 15 years, not incrementally improved, transformed, revolutionized, overturned. Things that would have taken decades of ground survey, machete in hand, hacking through jungle, are now revealed in weeks of data processing, and the revelations keep coming. Before we go further into the Amazon discoveries, let us talk about what LiDAR has done for our understanding of another ancient civilization, one that most people think they know reasonably well, the Maya. Most people have a mental image of the ancient Maya. They know about Chichen Itza with its Great Pyramid. They know about Tikal in Guatemala with those extraordinary temples rising above the jungle canopy. They know in a general way that the Maya were sophisticated, calendar keepers, astronomers, builders of impressive ceremonial architecture, but they also know or think they know that the Maya were not really urbanized in the way that, say, ancient Rome or ancient China were urbanized. The Maya in the standard picture lived in dispersed communities scattered through the jungle, coming together at ceremonial centers for ritual activities, but not really forming the kind of dense, integrated urban networks that define great civilizations. LiDAR has demolished this picture completely. In 2018, a consortium of researchers working under the banner of the PACUNAM LiDAR initiative published results from a survey of approximately 810 square miles of northern Guatemala, the heartland of the classic Maya civilization. What they found was not a dispersed landscape of scattered settlements with ceremonial centers. What they found was a connected, integrated urban landscape of almost incomprehensible scale and sophistication. The LiDAR revealed more than 60,000 previously unknown ancient structures. 60,000, hidden beneath the jungle canopy, invisible to every previous method of survey, but perfectly clear to the lasers. Among these structures were not just temples and palaces, though there were plenty of those, but also raised agricultural fields, irrigation canals, terraced hillsides, fortification walls, and most strikingly, an enormous network of raised causeways connecting cities to each other across the landscape. These causeways, the ancient Maya called them Sacbiab, meaning white roads, were not simple dirt tracks. They were engineered structures. Raised above the surrounding terrain on embankments of packed earth and stone, sometimes paved with white limestone plaster, wide enough for significant traffic, and extending in perfectly straight lines for miles, sometimes for dozens of miles, between cities. The LiDAR revealed that this causeway network was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Cities that archaeologists had thought of as isolated urban centers, separated by vast stretches of jungle, were in fact connected to each other and to smaller settlements in a web of infrastructure that looks, when you see the LiDAR images, startlingly like the kind of road network you would expect from a major ancient civilization. like the Roman road system, like the Inca highway network. But the Maya road network, unlike those famous examples, was completely invisible until LiDAR stripped the jungle away. And when it was revealed, it forced a fundamental rethinking of what the Maya were. They were not a civilization of dispersed farming communities with impressive ceremonial architecture. They were a civilization of interconnected cities, linked by a sophisticated infrastructure network, supporting a total population that researchers now estimate, based on the density of settlements revealed by LiDAR, may have been as high as 10 to 15 million people at the height of the Classic period. Some researchers have suggested even higher figures, 10 to 15 million people, in a jungle. Using a level of agricultural engineering, urban planning, and infrastructure development that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate, because we could not see it until lasers showed it to us. And those causeways, those sakbiab, those white roads cutting through the jungle in straight lines for mile after mile, they raise their own profound questions, because the Maya, as far as we know, did not use wheeled vehicles. They did not have horses or oxen or any other large draft animals. So what were these roads for? Foot traffic, certainly. Trade caravans of human porters carrying goods between cities. Processional routes for religious and political ceremonies. All of these explanations are plausible and none of them are new. But when you look at the LiDAR images and see the scale of this road network, the sheer number of causeways, their lengths, their engineering precision, you start to wonder whether the conventional explanations fully account for the investment. Why build roads this wide, this carefully engineered, this extensive, if all they carried was foot traffic? We will come back to that question. For now, let us file it away and move on, because there are more discoveries to examine, discoveries that take us far from the Amazon and the Yucatan to places with their own impossible secrets. Let us talk about Percy Fawcett, because any serious exploration of Amazonian mysteries has to include this man. Not just as a colorful historical character, though he is certainly that, but as someone whose story has taken on a new and profound significance in the light of what LiDAR has revealed. Percy Harrison Fawcett was a British Army officer, a surveyor, an explorer, and one of the most remarkable figures of the early 20th century. Between 1906 and 1924, he made 8 expeditions into the Amazon jungle, mapping unmapped territories, surveying borders, and accumulating an extraordinary body of knowledge about the region's geography, people, and history. He was decorated for his services. He was widely respected in the geographical and exploration community, and he was obsessed with something. He called it the city of Z. Fawcett was convinced, and his conviction deepened with each expedition, that somewhere in the unexplored interior of the Amazon, particularly in the Mato Grosso region of what is now Brazil, there existed the ruins of an ancient city. A sophisticated, possibly enormous ancient city, predating European contact, built by a civilization of remarkable advancement. Not a primitive jungle settlement, but something genuinely urban, genuinely monumental. A lost civilization whose existence had been hinted at in the accounts of early Spanish and Portuguese explorers and missionaries who had recorded legends, always second-hand, always tantalizingly unconfirmable, of wealthy, densely populated kingdoms somewhere in the jungle interior. Fawcett pored over these accounts. He gathered oral histories from indigenous peoples he encountered on his expeditions. He found, or claimed to find, a document known as Manuscript 512, preserved in the Brazilian National Archive, that described the discovery, by an 18th-century Portuguese expedition, of an ancient ruined city in the interior of Brazil. The document described stone archways, columns, broad streets, a temple, inscriptions in an unknown script. It described a city clearly abandoned for ages, but clearly built by a sophisticated civilization. Whether the document was genuine and what it actually described has been debated for centuries, but Fawcett believed it pointed to something real. In 1925, at the age of 57, Fawcett mounted what he intended to be his definitive expedition, the expedition that would find the city of Z. He took with him his eldest son Jack and Jack's best friend Raleigh Rimmel. They set out from the town of Cuiabá in Mato Grosso in May of 1925, heading into unexplored territory. The last communication received from Fawcett was a letter dated May 29, 1925, sent from a point he identified as Dead Horse Camp. In the letter, he expressed optimism about the journey ahead and indicated that he was pushing on into territory where no outsider had been before. He was never heard from again. His son and Rimal were never heard from again. The three of them vanished into the Amazon without a trace, joining the category of history's most haunting disappearances. In the decades that followed, at least 13 people died attempting to find out what had happened to Fawcett. His story became legendary, the obsessed explorer consumed by his obsession, disappearing into the jungle he had spent his life exploring. For most of the 20th century, Fawcett was remembered primarily as a romantic figure of the lost explorer variety. Brave, eccentric, possibly delusional in his conviction that a great city awaited him in the jungle. The mainstream archaeological consensus was that the Amazon simply could not have supported the kind of civilization he was looking for. The environment was too challenging, the agricultural base too limited, the evidence was simply not there. And then LiDAR changed everything, because it turns out that Fawcett was not delusional. He was not chasing a fantasy. He was decades ahead of his time, intuiting something that was real. The Amazon did support enormous, sophisticated, complex civilizations. The evidence was there all along, it was just buried under the canopy, invisible to every conventional method of investigation. The cities were real, the civilization was real. Percy Fawcett, who died in the jungle looking for a lost city, was looking for something that actually existed. Now, the specific city he was looking for, the city of Z, has not been definitively identified. We do not know whether any particular settlement revealed by LiDAR is what Fawcett called Z, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. But the broader point that the Amazon was home to ancient urban civilizations of a scale and sophistication that mainstream archaeology had denied for a century, that point has been vindicated. Fawcett's instinct, his conviction, his obsession, vindicated. There is something both triumphant and heartbreaking about that. Triumphant because the truth has finally emerged as truth has a way of doing. Heartbreaking because the man who spent his life pursuing that truth died in the jungle without ever knowing he was right. His story resonates not just as an adventure tale, but as a reminder of how the boundaries of accepted knowledge can constrain what we allow ourselves to look for, and how often the truth lies just beyond those boundaries, waiting to be found by someone willing to push past them. Now let us shift our gaze to another part of the world entirely. To a landscape as different from the Amazon jungle as it is possible to imagine, to the scorching plains of Lebanon, where a collection of ancient stones sits in the quiet town of Baalbek, stones that should not exist, stones that challenge every assumption we have about what ancient peoples were capable of. Baalbek, the name alone carries a kind of weight. In antiquity, the Romans knew it as Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and they built there one of the most extraordinary temple complexes in the ancient world. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek was, in its time, the largest Roman temple ever constructed. The Temple of Bacchus, which still stands in remarkable preservation, is so large and so elaborately decorated that it dwarfs the Parthenon in Athens. These are genuinely spectacular monuments to Roman engineering and ambition, and they would be worth visiting and studying on their own merits. But the Roman temples are not what makes Baalbek truly extraordinary. What makes Baalbek extraordinary is what the Romans built on top of. Beneath the Roman temple complex, forming the foundation platform on which the great temples were erected, is a terrace of ancient stone blocks that the Romans did not cut, that the Romans did not place. That preceded the Roman construction by an unknown and deeply contested span of time, and these stones are among the most remarkable objects on the face of the earth. The platform at Baalbek includes a course of stones known as the trilithon, 3 enormous limestone blocks placed side by side. Each of these blocks is approximately 60 feet long, 14 feet high, and 10 feet deep. Each one weighs, by careful modern calculation, approximately 800 tons. 800 tons each. And they are placed in their positions with a precision that leaves no room for a credit card between them. The joints are so tight, so perfectly fitted, that they have maintained their integrity through millennia of seismic activity and weathering. 800 tons, that is heavier than any single stone block the Romans ever moved, heavier than any block used in the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. These are among the heaviest stones ever deliberately moved and placed by human beings in all of recorded history. And there they sit, in a foundation that predates the great Roman construction project, laid by hands that history has not definitively identified. But here is where it gets even more extraordinary. In the quarry site just outside Baalbek, a site called the Hajar al-Hibla, or Stone of the Pregnant Woman, there lie several unfinished blocks that were apparently intended to be part of the same building program as the trilithon. And these blocks are larger still. There is one block, still partially attached to the bedrock from which it was being cut, that measures approximately 64 feet in length and weighs an estimated 1,000 tons. 1,000 tons, 1,000,000 kilograms. It was never moved from the quarry, perhaps because the project was abandoned, perhaps because of some catastrophe, perhaps for reasons we cannot know. But it was clearly cut with the intention of being moved and placed. Nearby in the same quarry, an even larger block was discovered more recently, a block estimated to weigh approximately 1,650 tons. 1,650 tons. This is the heaviest known worked stone block anywhere on the face of the earth. The fundamental question is simple to state and profoundly difficult to answer. How were these stones moved and placed? The Romans, for all their engineering genius, and they were genuine engineering geniuses, did not have the capability to move stones of this size. We know this because we know what Roman technology looked like. We have extensive documentation. We have surviving infrastructure, surviving texts, surviving artistic representations of Roman construction methods. The Romans used cranes, pulleys, counterweights, human labor, and animal power. They were extraordinarily good at all of this. But the heaviest stones the Romans ever moved in their greatest construction projects weighed, at most, a few hundred tons, and those were exceptional cases requiring extraordinary effort. Moving an 800-ton stone block is not just twice as hard as moving a 400-ton stone block. The engineering challenges scale non-linearly. The friction forces, the structural requirements of whatever lifting or dragging mechanism you use, the coordination of human or animal effort, all of it becomes exponentially more complex as the weight increases. Modern engineers, when they look at the Baalbek blocks, use words like impossible and we could barely do it today, and they are not being hyperbolic. Moving an 800-ton block with any level of precision, let alone setting it in place with millimeter accuracy next to two equally enormous blocks, would tax the capabilities of modern heavy lift equipment. So who moved them and how and when? Conventional archaeology points to various ancient building techniques, earthen ramps, wooden rollers, large organized labor forces. These techniques can be modeled, and in theory, with enough people and enough organization, it is possible to imagine moving very large stones. But the Baalbek blocks push the limits of these models to the breaking point and beyond. The honest answer, the answer that an increasing number of researchers are willing to state openly, is that we do not know. We do not know who built the original platform at Baalbek. We do not know how they moved and placed those stones. We do not know when they did it. And that not knowing is important. It is not a comfortable position for a field that prides itself on careful, evidence-based conclusions. But it is the honest position, and it points towards something that we will return to many times over the course of this documentary, the possibility that the ancient world contained levels of technical knowledge and capability that we have not yet accounted for. That there were people, or perhaps something before people, who understood physics and engineering in ways that allowed them to accomplish things that remain, to our eyes, frankly astonishing. Not far from Baalbek in terms of the broader canvas of ancient mysteries sits Egypt. And in Egypt, specifically in the desert near Saqqara, sits a structure that raises questions just as profound as those posed by the stones of Baalbek, though far fewer people have heard of it. The Serapeum of Saqqara. An underground labyrinth carved into the bedrock of the Egyptian desert, containing a series of massive granite sarcophagi that defy easy explanation. The Serapeum was a burial complex dedicated to the Apis bulls, sacred animals in ancient Egyptian religion, believed to be the earthly manifestation of the god Ptah, and after death of the god Osiris. When an Apis bull died, it was mummified with extraordinary care and interred in the Serapeum with full royal honors. This much is known, accepted, and uncontroversial. What is less easy to explain are the containers in which the bulls were placed. The Serapeum contains 24 enormous granite sarcophagi, each one carved from a single block of black granite. Each sarcophagus, box plus lid, weighs approximately 100 tons. 100 tons of granite cut and hollowed from a single block, the interior surface is polished to a flatness measurable in thousandths of an inch. The lid, weighing approximately 27 tons, fits so precisely on the box that the joint between them is essentially invisible. The corners of the interior are cut to a precision that modern machinists find remarkable, sharp, clean, geometrically perfect. Think about what it means to cut the interior of a granite box to that level of precision. Granite is one of the hardest natural stones there is. Cutting it requires tools harder than granite itself. Hollowing out a box from a single granite block, creating a perfectly rectangular internal space with flat walls and sharp corners and a polished surface, is an operation that, even with modern diamond-tipped tools and precision machinery, would be extraordinarily challenging. Doing it in a way that achieves flatness measurable in thousandths of an inch would require the kind of precision measurement and quality control that we associate with modern industrial manufacturing. The ancient Egyptians did not have diamond-tipped tools. They did not have precision measurement instruments of the kind we use today. They had copper tools, stone abrasives, wooden mallets, string lines, and extraordinary patience. With these tools, they were capable of remarkable things. The evidence of that is everywhere in Egypt. But the Serapeum sarcophagi represent a level of precision that pushes even the most generous interpretation of Egyptian technological capability into deeply uncomfortable territory. And there is another question. These 100-ton sarcophagi are inside an underground tunnel system. The tunnels are not large enough to have admitted the finished sarcophagi through their entrances. Which means either the sarcophagi were carved in place, inside the tunnels, in near total darkness, in extremely confined spaces, or the tunnels were built around them after the sarcophagi were placed. Neither option is simple. Carving a 100-ton granite sarcophagus to modern machining tolerances in a dark, confined underground tunnel without power tools is a task that strains the imagination to breaking point. Building tunnels around pre-placed sarcophagi would require a construction sequence of remarkable complexity. Researchers and authors who have examined the Serapeum closely, including Christopher Dunn, an engineer who has written extensively on the machining precision of ancient Egyptian artifacts, have argued that the level of precision in the Serapeum sarcophagi is consistent not with hand tool manufacture, but with machine manufacture. With some form of powered precision cutting equipment that should not have existed in ancient Egypt by our conventional timeline. This is a deeply controversial claim. Mainstream Egyptology firmly rejects it, but the precision is real, it has been measured with modern instruments, and the question of how it was achieved remains, in the honest assessment of people who look carefully at the data, genuinely open. From Egypt, let us make a seemingly jarring jump from massive stone objects of prehistoric antiquity to a small, delicate, almost exquisitely beautiful object housed in the British Museum, an object called the Lycurgus Cup. The Lycurgus Cup is a Roman glass drinking vessel, probably made in Rome sometime in the 4th century of the Common Era. It depicts the myth of King Lycurgus of Thrace, a mythological king who, according to legend, attacked the god Dionysus and was punished by being entangled in grapevines and killed. The craftsmanship of the cup is extraordinary by any standard. The figures are intricately carved in a technique called cage work, creating a 3-dimensional scene wrapped around the vessel. It is a masterpiece of ancient glassworking. But the Lycurgus Cup is in this documentary not because of its artistic achievement. It is here because of what it is made of and what that material reveals about the technological knowledge of its makers. The glass of the Lycurgus Cup changes color depending on the light. When lit from the front reflected light, it appears opaque green. When lit from behind transmitted light, it becomes translucent red gold. This dichroic effect is visually striking and immediately puzzling. What causes it? When researchers subjected the cup to modern analysis, they found the answer. The glass contains tiny particles of gold and silver, nanoparticles, particles measured in billionths of a meter, distributed throughout the glass matrix. It is these nanoparticles that create the dichroic effect. Different wavelengths of light interact differently with particles of different sizes at the nanoscale, and the Roman glassmakers had somehow produced particles of precisely the right size, approximately 50 to 70 nanometers in diameter, to create the specific color-changing effect seen in the cup. Here is why this is astounding. Nanotechnology, the deliberate manipulation of matter at the nanoscale, is generally considered one of the frontier technologies of the modern age. Richard Feynman's famous 1959 lecture, "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom," is typically cited as the conceptual founding moment of the field. The ability to actually engineer materials at the nanoscale, to deliberately produce particles of specific sizes and compositions to achieve specific effects, is something that the modern world has developed only in the past few decades, with the aid of electron microscopes and sophisticated chemical engineering. The Romans who made the Lycurgus Cup were doing this, not with the conceptual framework or the measuring instruments of modern nanotechnology, but empirically. Through some process, perhaps of heating metal-infused glass, perhaps of trial and error over generations of glassworking, they had discovered how to produce nanoparticle-embedded glass that achieved a specific optical effect. They did not know they were doing nanotechnology in the modern sense of the term. But they were doing something that achieved a nanoscale material effect that modern researchers, when they first analyzed the cup, simply could not believe was ancient. More recently, researchers have explored whether the Lycurgus Cup's nanoparticle structure might have applications for modern biosensing technology. Because the optical properties of nanoparticles are sensitive to their environment, to the liquids surrounding them, for instance, a vessel constructed like the Lycurgus Cup could theoretically change color in response to different liquids placed inside it. This might even have been part of its original purpose, a kind of magical cup that revealed the nature of whatever was poured into it, perhaps used to detect poisons or to impress guests at banquets. Whether this interpretation is correct, we cannot say for certain. But the possibility adds another layer of extraordinary sophistication to an object that already has plenty. What the Lycurgus Cup tells us, at minimum, is this: that ancient peoples were capable of achieving technologically sophisticated material effects that we do not expect from them, effects that we recognize as sophisticated only because we have developed independent modern frameworks that allow us to analyze and understand what they were doing. The Romans who made the cup achieved nanotechnology without knowing it. The ancient Egyptians who made the Serapeum sarcophagi achieved precision machining without calling it that. The builders of Baalbek's foundation platform achieved feats of heavy engineering that we struggle to match today. In each case, the sophistication is real, measurable, undeniable. The question is not whether these ancient peoples achieved these things. They did. The evidence is physical and present and can be examined. The question is how, and the honest answer in each case is that we do not fully know. Now let us go even further in space, if not necessarily in time. Let us cross the Atlantic and the Pacific and travel to the high altiplano of Bolivia, that bleak, breathtaking highland plateau at nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air is thin and the light is sharp, and the ruins of Tiwanaku sit in silent, massive testimony to something that our history books have not adequately explained. Tiwanaku was one of the most important pre-Columbian civilizations in the Andes. At its peak, around 700 to 900 of the Common Era, it was an urban center supporting a population of perhaps 20,000 to 40,000 people, with agricultural systems capable of feeding a much larger regional population through the use of sophisticated raised field farming that managed the waterlogged soils of the Altiplano. Tiwanaku's art, iconography, and religious imagery spread across a vast region, influencing cultures from northern Chile to southern Peru. It was, by any reasonable measure, a major civilization, but associated with Tiwanaku, and in some interpretations predating it, is a site called Puma Punku, and Puma Punku is one of the most baffling archaeological sites on the face of the earth. Puma Punku, meaning Gate of the Puma in the Aymara language, is a large earthen platform mound accompanied by a complex of stone structures, all located about half a mile southwest of the main Tiwanaku site. The site has been heavily disturbed over the centuries. Stones have been removed and used for other building projects, and the Spanish colonial period was particularly hard on it. What remains is a scatter of enormous stone blocks in various states of preservation, some still partially in position, others tumbled and moved from their original locations. And these stone blocks are extraordinary. They are made from two primary materials, sandstone and andesite. The sandstone blocks are local, there are sandstone outcrops nearby, but the andesite blocks, hard, dense volcanic rock, come from a quarry at Copacabana, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, approximately 56 miles away. Some of these andesite blocks weigh over 100 tons. Moving 100-ton blocks of andesite 56 miles, across terrain that includes the shores of a large lake, using the technology available to the Tiwanaku culture, no wheeled vehicles, no large draft animals, is an engineering achievement that is difficult to explain by conventional means. But the movement of the stones, impressive as it is not the most puzzling aspect of Puma Punku. The most puzzling aspect is how they were worked. Because the precision of the stoneworking at Puma Punku is, by the testimony of engineers and machinists who have examined it carefully, remarkable to the point of being inexplicable by hand tool means. The blocks at Puma Punku contain features that are deeply puzzling. Perfectly straight cuts of uniform depth running along the surfaces of the stone, precise right angles maintained over long distances. Geometric shapes, H-shapes, I-shapes, interlocking profiles, cut with a consistency suggesting that multiple blocks were cut to the same template. Holes bored into the stone with smooth, consistent circular cross-sections. Surfaces polished to a smoothness that is inconsistent with the use of stone tools. Engineer and author Christopher Dunn, whose analysis of the Serapeum sarcophagi we mentioned earlier, has also examined Puma Punku and reached similar conclusions, that the precision of the stoneworking is more consistent with machine cutting than with hand tool cutting. Specifically, the long, straight grooves of uniform depth look, to anyone familiar with industrial machining, like the output of a milling machine or a router rather than the output of a hammer and chisel. Now, the conventional archaeological explanation is that these effects were achieved with hard stone tools, with harder stones used to abrade softer ones, combined with copper tools, wooden tools, and an extraordinary degree of patience and skill. And this explanation cannot be definitively ruled out. Ancient peoples achieved remarkable precision with hand tools in many contexts. But at Puma Punku, the precision, the consistency across many stones, the complexity of the interlocking shapes, all of this pushes the hand tool explanation to its limits, and in the view of many careful observers, beyond them. There is also the question of the overall design. The H-shaped blocks at Puma Punku are particularly striking. These are stones cut into a complex H profile, a shape with multiple internal recesses and protrusions, and they appear in multiple copies that are virtually identical to each other. The consistency of these complex shapes across multiple stones strongly suggests the use of some form of template or jig, some mechanism for ensuring that each block is cut to precisely the same profile. This kind of templated precision, applied to hard stone, is fundamentally an industrial concept. It is the concept of interchangeable parts, of standardized manufacturing. It is not what we expect from the Tiwanaku culture in the first millennium of the Common Era. What do we make of all this? The honest answer, again, is that we do not fully know. The stones are real, their precision is real. The engineering puzzles they present are real. What is not real, or at least not established, is any specific explanation of how they were made that fully accounts for everything we observe. This is a genuine mystery, and we should treat it as such rather than force it into a framework that does not quite fit. Let us step back now and look at the bigger picture. We have been talking about individual sites, individual artifacts, individual mysteries. But what if there is a pattern? What if these anomalies, Baalbek, the Serapeum, the Lycurgus Cup, Puma Punku, are not isolated puzzles, but rather scattered pieces of a larger puzzle? What if they point, however indirectly, to a common source, a common tradition of knowledge and technique that predates the civilizations we know about? This is the territory of what might be called the lost civilization hypothesis. And its most prominent modern advocate, though certainly not its only one, is a researcher named Graham Hancock. Graham Hancock is a British journalist and author who, since the early 1990s, has been arguing that the conventional timeline of human civilization is fundamentally wrong. His central thesis, developed across a series of best-selling books beginning with Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, is straightforward to state that there existed, before the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, a civilization of remarkable sophistication. A global maritime civilization, he argues, capable of seafaring, astronomy, and advanced engineering. A civilization that was destroyed, or at least severely damaged, by the catastrophic global changes associated with the end of the Ice Age, including rising sea levels, massive floods, and possibly cosmic impacts. And a civilization that survived only in fragments, in small groups of survivors who carried their knowledge to different parts of the world, where they became the mysterious founding figures of later civilizations. The culture bearers who showed up in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, with knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere. Hancock's thesis has been dismissed, often contemptuously, by mainstream archaeology. He is not a credentialed archaeologist. His arguments, critics say, cherry-pick evidence, misrepresent data, and weave a grand narrative that the facts do not support. These are serious criticisms, and they should not be dismissed, but here is the thing. Hancock's core claim that there were sophisticated human societies before the conventional start of civilization around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and that these societies may have had knowledge and capabilities that were lost in the catastrophes of the late Ice Age, has received in recent years a degree of unexpected support from mainstream science. Not full support, not vindication, but support, and it has come from a surprising direction. In 2007, a group of researchers published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proposing what became known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The Younger Dryas is a period of abrupt climate cooling that began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted for about 1,200 years before ending just as abruptly. During the Younger Dryas, temperatures in many parts of the northern hemisphere plummeted dramatically by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions in a matter of decades or even years. Ice sheets that had been retreating advanced again. The great megafauna of the northern continents, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave lions, went extinct in a geological eye blink. And a human culture known as the Clovis people, who had spread across the Americas, disappeared from the archaeological record. The conventional explanation for the Younger Dryas was, until 2007, a disruption of ocean circulation patterns, specifically the collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation caused by a massive influx of freshwater from melting glaciers. This is still considered a significant contributing factor. But the 2007 paper proposed something additional, something far more dramatic, that the Younger Dryas was triggered, at least in part, by the impact or airburst of a comet or asteroid, or a fragmented swarm of cosmic debris, over the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier that covered most of northern North America. The evidence cited included a thin layer of unusual materials, nanodiamonds, platinum group elements, shocked quartz, magnetic spherules, and other impact indicators, found at archaeological sites dating to the Younger Dryas boundary across multiple continents. These materials, the researchers argued, were consistent with the products of a cosmic impact event. The hypothesis was immediately controversial. Mainstream geology and archaeology pushed back hard. Multiple papers attempted to replicate the findings and found mixed results, some confirming the presence of the proposed impact materials, others failing to detect them. The debate has been vigorous, sometimes heated, and has not been fully resolved, but here is where the story becomes genuinely significant for our purposes. In 2018 and subsequent years, the evidence base for some form of cosmic catastrophe at the Younger Dryas boundary has grown substantially. A study published in the Journal of Geology in 2018, covering a large research team, analyzed materials from sites in North America, Europe, and the Middle East, and found the impact markers at all of them, suggesting not a localized event but a continent-spanning or global one. A platinum anomaly consistent with cosmic impact was found in the Greenland ice cores at exactly the Younger Dryas boundary. A 31-kilometer crater discovered beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in Greenland has been dated to sometime within the last 800,000 years and may, some researchers argue, be as young as the Younger Dryas period. None of this is proven. The science is ongoing, contested, and evolving. But the hypothesis that something catastrophic, cosmic, perhaps, happened to the Earth at approximately 12,900 years ago, coinciding with mass extinctions, the collapse of the Clovis culture, and a dramatic climate shift, is no longer the fringe position it once seemed. It is a live scientific hypothesis supported by a growing body of peer-reviewed evidence. And this matters for our story, for the lost civilization story, because if there was indeed a cosmic catastrophe at the Younger Dryas boundary, and if there were sophisticated human societies anywhere on Earth at that time, those societies would have been exposed to an extinction-level event. Massive flooding as ice sheets melted, firestorms from impact airbursts, tsunamis, climate disruption on a global scale. Civilizations built in coastal regions, and most civilizations are built near water, would have been particularly vulnerable. Their cities would have been inundated by the rising seas of the post-glacial period. Their agricultural systems would have been devastated by climate disruption. Their populations would have crashed. What would have survived? Fragments, refugees. People who carried memories and knowledge in oral tradition, in ritual and architectural form, but who had lost the material infrastructure of their civilization. People who, arriving in other lands, would have seemed remarkable to the simpler societies they encountered, who would have been remembered as gods or as culture heroes or as the ancestors who brought the gifts of civilization. Is this what happened? We do not know. We genuinely do not know. But the question is no longer as absurd as it once seemed. The science of cosmic catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age is real and growing. The existence of sophisticated human activity much earlier than conventionally assumed is being confirmed by an increasing number of archaeological discoveries. The foundation of the conventional timeline is not as solid as it once appeared. And at the center of this revised picture, at the site that, more than any other, has forced a rethinking of when human civilization began, sits a place in the highlands of southeastern Turkey, a place called Göbekli Tepe, a place that has been called, by at least one prominent archaeologist, the most important archaeological discovery in human history. Göbekli Tepe was excavated beginning in 1994 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who continued working there until his death in 2014. What Schmidt found, what he and his team uncovered from beneath a deliberate burial mound of accumulated debris, was a complex of megalithic enclosures, each containing a series of large T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles, their faces carved with extraordinary high-relief sculptures of animals, foxes, snakes, boars, birds, lions, scorpions, vultures, and with abstract symbols whose meaning remains unknown. The pillars themselves are remarkable. The largest stand approximately 18 feet tall and weigh between 10 and 20 tons. They are shaped into the T form with considerable precision. The carvings on them are executed with skill and aesthetic sophistication, not the crude scratching of primitive people, but the confident, accomplished work of artists with a clear tradition and a mastery of their medium. And the dating. This is the point that changed everything. The dating of Göbekli Tepe places its construction at approximately 11,600 to 9,600 years before the present. 11,600 years ago, at the absolute minimum, some layers of the site may be older still. This makes Göbekli Tepe the oldest known megalithic structure on Earth by a very wide margin. It predates Stonehenge by approximately 6,000 years. It predates the Great Pyramids of Egypt by approximately 7,000 years. It was built at a time when, according to conventional archaeological theory, human beings were simple hunter-gatherers with no agriculture, no permanent settlements, no organized religion, no social hierarchy, and no capacity for the kind of coordinated labor and sophisticated architectural design required to build what Göbekli Tepe represents. That is the problem. That is the beautiful, destabilizing, history-rewriting problem. Building Göbekli Tepe, quarrying the limestone pillars, shaping them to the T-form, transporting them to the site, erecting them in careful arrangements, carving them with sophisticated imagery, all of this required a level of social organization, technological capability, and coordinated labor that conventional archaeology assigned to societies thousands of years later. Agricultural societies, settled societies. Societies with the surplus food production, the division of labor, the specialized craftspeople, and the organizational structures that allowed monumental construction projects. But Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture, or so the conventional sequence runs. The people who built it were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, simple, mobile, living in small bands with no time or social capacity for monumental architecture. This contradiction has forced archaeologists to reconsider the sequence. Perhaps some researchers now argue Göbekli Tepe itself suggests that the conventional sequence is backwards, that it was the demands of large-scale ritual and construction projects that drove the development of agriculture, rather than the other way around. That people gathered at sites like Göbekli Tepe for religious or ceremonial purposes, that those gatherings required organized food supply, and that the need to feed those gatherings drove the development of farming. This is an interesting and perhaps partially correct hypothesis, but it does not fully address the deeper question, which is, where did the knowledge and capability to build Göbekli Tepe come from? Even if the building of the site drove some aspects of social organization, some group of people had to already possess the vision, the technical knowledge, and some level of organization to initiate the project. The sophistication does not come from nowhere. And there is another aspect of Göbekli Tepe that has received less attention in mainstream discussions but is profoundly interesting: the astronomical dimension. Researcher Andrew Collins and others have noted that the arrangements of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe appear to encode astronomical information. The alignments of the enclosures and the orientations of specific pillars within them correlate with the positions of significant stars and star clusters as they appeared in the sky at the time of construction, 11,600 years ago. In particular, researchers have pointed to alignments with the Pleiades star cluster and with the constellation we now call Scorpius, astronomical features that appear repeatedly in the carved imagery of the pillars as well as in their orientations. But the astronomical significance goes even deeper than simple stellar alignment. Because of a phenomenon called precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, the positions of stars relative to specific horizon points change over long time periods. An astronomical alignment that is precise for one era will be off by a measurable amount a few thousand years later, and will be very different 13,000 years later. Researchers who have studied the astronomy of Göbekli Tepe have found that the builders appear to have encoded not just contemporary stellar positions, but an awareness of precession itself, an awareness of the long cycle of the sky's movement. If this interpretation is correct, it is extraordinary. Precession was described in Western astronomical tradition by Hipparchus around 127 BCE. That is the conventional date of its discovery. But the builders of Göbekli Tepe, more than 11,000 years ago, may have already understood this phenomenon and encoded it in their monuments. That would represent astronomical knowledge far, far in advance of what we attribute to hunter-gatherers, unless, of course, they were not simply hunter-gatherers, unless they were or had access to knowledge from something older and more sophisticated, something we have not yet fully uncovered. The question of what was lost in the catastrophes at the end of the last ice age is one that haunts the emerging field of what might be called catastrophic archaeology, the study of how ancient civilizations were affected by the dramatic climate and environmental changes of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. And it is a question that leads us back with a new perspective to the Amazon. Because the Amazon, it now appears, was not simply a place where mysterious civilizations developed independently and then were swallowed by the jungle. It was, according to emerging research, a place where the land itself was transformed, where the jungle, far from being a pristine wilderness untouched by human hands, is in fact a managed landscape, a garden of continental scale, cultivated by ancient peoples over thousands of years. This is the argument advanced by researchers including Charles Mann, author of 1491, and more recently by a growing body of ecological and archaeological research. The evidence takes several forms. First, there is the matter of terra preta, dark earth in Portuguese. Across vast areas of the Amazon basin, researchers have found patches of extraordinarily fertile black soil that is fundamentally different in composition from the typical poor, leached soils of the rainforest. Terra preta is rich in charcoal, organic matter, and the byproducts of human habitation, broken pottery, animal bones, human waste. It is, in essence, the accumulated result of ancient human settlement and agriculture. And it is remarkable not just for its fertility. Terra preta soils are still far more productive today than the surrounding Amazon soils, but for its extent. Terra preta deposits cover an estimated 10% of the Amazon basin, an area larger than France. 10% of the Amazon basin, covered in ancient, anthropogenic, extraordinarily fertile soil, the product of human occupation and agricultural management stretching back, in some cases, thousands of years. This is not a sparse wilderness dotted with occasional campsites. This is a landscape that was intensively managed over vast areas, over very long time periods, by populations large enough and organized enough to transform the soil chemistry of an area the size of Western Europe. Second, there is the distribution of plant species across the Amazon. Research published in 2017 in the journal Science found that many of the species that dominate the Amazon forest today, species that contribute most significantly to the forest's overall biomass, are species that were domesticated by ancient peoples. Cacao, Brazil nut, rubber, and dozens of other species that are both economically valuable and ecologically significant are distributed across the Amazon not randomly, as one might expect from purely natural processes, but in patterns that correlate with known ancient settlement sites. The Amazon forest, in other words, bears the botanical signature of ancient human management. It is, at least in part, an intentional garden of continental scale, planted and tended by civilizations that our history books say did not exist. Combine this with the LiDAR findings, the cities, the causeways, the agricultural earthworks, and a picture emerges that is genuinely revolutionary. The Amazon was not a wilderness, it was a civilization. A vast, complex, sophisticated civilization that managed its landscape so thoroughly that even the composition of its soils and the distribution of its tree species bear the marks of human intention. And then it ended. Contact with Europeans brought diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, to populations with no immunity. The death rates were catastrophic. By some estimates, 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century following European contact. 90% in the Amazon, complex urban civilizations that had taken millennia to build were reduced in a few generations to small remnant populations struggling to survive. The infrastructure went unmaintained. The causeways were reclaimed by vegetation. The earthwork cities were buried under accumulating organic material. The agricultural fields were swallowed by encroaching forest. And the forest, the vast, apparently primeval Amazon rainforest, grew up over the ruins of the civilization it had once served, concealing everything so completely that within a few centuries, outsiders who came to the Amazon genuinely believed they were looking at a pristine, untouched wilderness. They were not. They were looking at a graveyard, a green, beautiful, teeming graveyard of a civilization that had been one of the greatest in the ancient world. This context, this understanding of what the Amazon lost and how it was lost, gives Percy Fawcett's story a new and tragic dimension. He was not chasing a fantasy. He was catching a glimpse through indigenous oral history, through manuscript 512, through the occasional tantalizing glimpse of earthworks or ruins, of a reality that was hidden all around him. He walked through a civilization without knowing it. He sensed its presence, he believed in it with a conviction that cost him his life, and he was right. As we continue our journey across the ancient world, let us turn our attention to another revolutionary tool in the modern archaeologist's arsenal, one that, like LiDAR, is revealing things that were previously invisible. This tool is the analysis of ancient DNA, and what it is telling us about human prehistory is, in its own way, just as revolutionary as what LiDAR has revealed about ancient settlement patterns. Over the past decade, advances in the extraction and sequencing of ancient DNA recovered from the bones and teeth of people who died thousands of years ago, have allowed researchers to trace the movements and mixing of ancient human populations with a precision that was previously unimaginable. And what this research is revealing is a picture of prehistoric human movement and interaction that is far more complex, far more widespread, and far more interconnected than anyone had imagined. We now know from ancient DNA analysis that the ancestors of indigenous Amazonian peoples include genetic components that are more closely related to indigenous Australians and Melanesians than to any other living population outside the Americas. This finding, published in 2015 by a team led by Pontus Skoglund and David Reich, was startling. It suggests that among the founding populations of the Americas were groups that had migrated not only across the land bridge of Beringia, the conventional route of peopling the Americas, but possibly by a coastal or even maritime route that somehow connected the Pacific world to the Americas in deep prehistory. What this tells us at minimum is that the ancient world was far more connected than we have thought. That maritime travel, real, sustained, long-distance maritime travel, was occurring in the deep past, tens of thousands of years ago, by peoples who left no written records and few archaeological traces, but who moved across vast distances and whose genetic legacy persists in the descendants of their journeys. It also tells us something about the complexity of prehistoric human societies. The ability to organize and undertake long ocean voyages, even in small boats, even over multiple generations, requires a level of accumulated knowledge, planning, and social organization that we do not typically attribute to the deep past. Navigation across open ocean requires astronomical knowledge, knowledge of stars, of currents, of seasonal winds. Sustained oceanic voyaging requires knowledge of food storage, water management, and boat construction. None of these things come easily. They require the kind of organized, intergenerational transmission of specialized knowledge that we associate with complex societies. Yet the evidence in ancient DNA, in the archaeology of Pacific and coastal regions, in the extraordinary distribution of similar material cultures across vast ocean distances, points firmly toward exactly this kind of capability existing in the deep prehistoric past, in a past so deep that we have barely begun to look carefully at it. And this brings us finally to a question that underlies everything we have been discussing. A question that has been building through all of these stories of LiDAR revealed cities, of impossible stone structures, of ancient nanotechnology and precision engineering, of astronomical knowledge encoded in 11,000-year-old temples, of lost civilizations buried under jungle and ocean. The question is this: what if the conventional timeline of human civilization is not just wrong in the details, but wrong in a more fundamental way? What if the story of human progress, of the steady, linear ascent from simple hunter-gatherers to complex urban civilization, a story that we have told ourselves with great confidence for a very long time, is not the whole story? What if it is not even the most important part of the story? What if civilization in some form, sophisticated, organized, technically capable civilization, is far older than we have thought, not by a few centuries or a few millennia, but by much more? What if the cultures we call ancient were themselves built on the ruins of something older? What if the Egyptians who built the pyramids were themselves inheriting traditions and knowledge from a more distant past? What if Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of the story of human civilization, but a chapter somewhere in the middle, a rebuilding perhaps after a catastrophe, by people trying to recover and preserve knowledge from a world that had been largely destroyed? These questions cannot be answered definitively with the evidence currently available, but they can be asked, and they should be asked. Because the evidence that is accumulating from LiDAR surveys and ancient DNA analysis and geological impact studies and precision measurements of ancient stone is making these questions harder and harder to dismiss. The story of human civilization is longer than we thought, more complex than we thought, more connected across time and space than we thought. And it contains mysteries, real, substantial, physical, measurable mysteries, that our current frameworks do not adequately explain. We are only beginning to understand the scale of what is buried, only beginning to grasp how much has been hidden by jungle, by ocean, by the accumulated weight of centuries, and sometimes by the limits of our own willingness to look past what we think we know. Let us return now to the Amazon and to the most recent LiDAR discoveries, because the story there is still unfolding, and what is being found continues to push the boundaries of what we thought possible. In 2022, a research team led by archaeologist Heiko Prümers published results of a LiDAR survey of the Llanos de Mojos, the same Bolivian savanna region we discussed earlier, that represented a quantum leap in our understanding of the region's ancient urbanism. Using LiDAR data collected from aircraft over an area of approximately 4,500 square kilometers, the team revealed not just individual settlement sites, but an entire urban system of staggering complexity. The survey revealed 6 major urban sites, each with its own internal civic ceremonial core, a central platform mound or cone, typically rising 15 to 20 meters above the surrounding terrain, surrounded by the remnants of what were clearly public plazas and monumental architecture. Around these civic cores, the LiDAR data showed dense concentrations of residential mounds, platform structures of varying sizes that served as the foundations for homes and household structures, elevated above the seasonally flooded savanna floor. The residential areas are laid out with a clear internal order: streets, or at least corridors of open space, separating clusters of mounds, suggesting something very much like a planned urban neighborhood. And connecting these settlements to each other and to the surrounding landscape, the now familiar network of causeways and canals. The causeways at the Casarabe sites in the Llanos de Mojos are not random earthworks. They are straight, they are wide, they run between specific points with obvious intentionality, and they are accompanied by canals that served both for drainage of the waterlogged terrain and for water transport and management. What the Prümers study demonstrated dramatically and quantitatively is that the largest of these urban centers, the site called Katoka, covered an area of approximately 147 hectares and contained, by conservative estimate, thousands of platform mounds. Many of these mounds are large enough to have supported significant structures, not just individual houses but communal buildings, perhaps storage facilities, perhaps ceremonial structures. The overall picture is of an urban landscape of genuine density and sophistication. The researchers estimated, based on the settlement patterns and the agricultural infrastructure visible in the LiDAR data, that the Casarabe culture supported populations on the order of thousands to tens of thousands of people at the largest sites. The entire settlement system across the surveyed region may have supported a regional population of hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands of people living in a complex urban network in the seasonally flooded savanna of what is now Bolivia more than 1,000 years ago, and we knew essentially nothing about this until lasers revealed it from the air. The agricultural system that supported this population is itself worthy of extended discussion. The Llanos de Mojos is a challenging agricultural environment. The region floods seasonally, and the floodwaters can cover the landscape for months. The soils, while potentially fertile when properly managed, are not naturally suited to the intensive agriculture required to support urban populations. The solution developed by the Casarabe culture, and it was a solution of genuine engineering sophistication, was a system of raised fields. Raised fields are exactly what they sound like: agricultural fields raised above the surrounding terrain on artificial platforms of heaped soil. The spaces between the raised fields, what amount to canals or drainage channels, allow excess water to drain away during flooding and retain moisture during dry periods. This creates a microclimate within the field system that buffers against both flood and drought stress, dramatically increasing the reliability and productivity of the crops grown on the raised platforms. The LiDAR data from the Llanos de Mojos reveals raised field systems of extraordinary extent, covering hundreds of square kilometers around the urban centers. The scale of earth moving required to create these raised field systems is almost incomprehensible. Millions of cubic meters of soil moved by hand, because that is the only way it could have been done, to create an agricultural landscape that could feed a large, dense, urban population in a challenging environment. This was not primitive subsistence farming. This was industrial-scale landscape engineering. This was a civilization that understood its environment deeply enough to transform it, not destroy it, but transform it into a sustainable, highly productive agricultural system. And it was doing this on a scale and with a level of organizational sophistication that belongs in any honest list of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. And yet it was invisible to us until 2022, hidden under the grass and the seasonal floods of the Bolivian savanna, because no one thought to look carefully, because the assumption, the deeply wrong assumption, was that the Amazon and its adjacent regions could not have supported civilizations of this scale. The lesson is simple and profound. Our assumptions about what ancient peoples were and were not capable of, about where civilizations could and could not have existed, have been consistently wrong. The evidence keeps overturning them. LiDAR has given us a new eye, an eye that can see through the concealment of time and vegetation, and everywhere that eye is turned, in region after region that we thought we understood, we find that we were wrong. We find more. More cities, more people, more complexity, more sophistication than we allowed ourselves to imagine. How many more revelations are waiting? How many more ancient urban landscapes are buried under forests and savannas and shallow ocean waters, waiting for the right technology and the right inquiry to reveal them? The answer increasingly seems to be a great many, more than we have ever imagined. As we close the first part of our journey through these extraordinary discoveries, let us step back and try to hold the full picture in view. Because what we have covered so far, the LiDAR cities of the Amazon and the Maya world, the impossible stones of Baalbek, the precision of the Serapeum sarcophagi, the nanotechnology of the Lycurgus Cup, the engineering puzzles of Puma Punku, the cosmic catastrophe hypothesis of the Younger Dryas, the astronomical sophistication of Göbekli Tepe, all of these things are pieces of something. Pieces of a picture that is larger than any one of them individually. That picture is this: the history of human civilization, as it has been taught for the past century, is incomplete at best and seriously misleading at worst. The timeline we have accepted: agriculture beginning around 10,000 years ago, first cities around 5,000 years ago, advanced civilization a few thousand years after that, is a timeline that describes only what we can see easily. It does not describe what was there. It does not account for what the jungle has hidden, what the ocean has drowned, what the desert sands have buried, what the ice has covered. It is a history of survivors and remnants, not a history of the full scope of human experience on this planet. What that full scope looked like, we are only beginning to understand. And what we are understanding is that it was far richer, far more complex, far more capable, and far more mysterious than we have been taught. The questions are enormous. They are not all answerable with current evidence, but they are the right questions, and the technology and the science and the intellectual courage to ask them and pursue them are, at this remarkable moment in the history of human inquiry, finally coming together. In the second part of our documentary, we will press even deeper into these mysteries. We will explore the extraordinary discoveries at Göbekli Tepe's astronomical dimensions in more detail. We will examine what ancient texts and traditions from around the world say about a lost civilization before the flood. We will travel to the Sinai Peninsula and look at new discoveries that suggest the ancient Egyptians were environmental engineers of a sophistication we are only beginning to appreciate. And we will try to answer as best we can the greatest question of all: where did it all begin? What was the source? What is the civilization or the tradition or the knowledge system that lies at the root of all these mysteries? The story of humanity's ancient past is not finished. It is, in the most exciting possible sense, just beginning. And the most extraordinary chapters may be the ones we have not yet found, buried under jungle, hidden under ocean, concealed in plain sight among the monuments of ancient peoples who left us their buildings, but not quite enough of their words to tell us who they really were and what they really knew. But we are getting closer. LiDAR by LiDAR, excavation by excavation, ancient DNA sample by ancient DNA sample, precision measurement by precision measurement. We are getting closer to the truth, and the truth, as everything we have covered today suggests, is more extraordinary than the myths. Stay with us. The journey continues. Welcome back. If you are joining us for the first time, we strongly encourage you to watch part 1 before continuing, because the story we are telling is a long one and every piece of it matters. But if you are already here, already familiar with what we covered in the first half of this journey, then you know that we left off at a place of profound questioning. A place where the evidence we have examined, the LiDAR cities of the Amazon, the impossible stones of Baalbek, the precision machined granite of the Serapeum, the nanotechnology of Roman glass, the engineering mysteries of Puma Punku, the cosmic catastrophe at the end of the last ice age, the ancient astronomical knowledge encoded in the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, all of it points toward something larger. Something that the conventional history of human civilization has not adequately explained. In this second part, we are going to go deeper. We are going to push further back in time and further into the evidence. We are going to examine what the world's oldest myths and sacred traditions say about a lost civilization before the Great Flood. We are going to explore the staggering new discoveries emerging from the Sinai Peninsula, discoveries that reveal an ancient Egyptian mastery of environmental engineering that reframes everything we thought we knew about that civilization. We are going to look at the mathematics encoded in the world's most famous ancient monuments and ask what those numbers were trying to tell us and who they were trying to tell. We are going to visit the underwater world, the drowned landscapes of the continental shelves, and think seriously about what lies beneath the waves in areas that were dry land when the last ice age held the world in its grip. And ultimately, we are going to try to synthesize all of this into something coherent. Not a definitive answer. The evidence does not yet permit definitive answers, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not being honest with you, but a framework, a way of thinking about the deep human past that accounts for the full range of evidence we have, that does not sweep inconvenient data under the rug, and that opens doors rather than closing them. Because that is what the best science and the best history do. They open doors, they expand the scope of what we can ask and what we can know. And right now, at this remarkable moment in the history of human inquiry, the doors being opened by LiDAR and ancient DNA and geological impact studies and precision archaeology are revealing corridors that stretch back much further than we imagined, into a past that is darker, richer, more complex, and more extraordinary than anything we have been taught. Let us begin. We ended part 1 with Göbekli Tepe, that extraordinary site in southeastern Turkey whose construction, 11,600 years ago, overturns everything we thought we knew about when organized, sophisticated human society began. But in part 1 we only scratched the surface of what Göbekli Tepe represents, because the site is not just old. It is not just the world's oldest known megalithic structure. It is something more specific and more profound than that. It is an observatory, a monument to the sky, a physical record carved in stone of astronomical knowledge of extraordinary sophistication, knowledge that, in the estimation of researchers who have studied it carefully, includes an awareness of celestial phenomena that we did not think human beings understood until thousands of years later. Let us be precise about what the astronomical argument at Göbekli Tepe actually claims, because precision matters here and vagueness is the enemy of honest inquiry. The site consists of multiple enclosures, labeled by researchers as enclosures A, B, C, D, and others. The most studied and best preserved are enclosures C and D, which date to approximately 11,600 years ago. Each enclosure consists of a series of T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in a roughly circular pattern, with 2 larger central pillars in the middle. The pillars are carved with animal imagery and abstract symbols. Researcher Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh, working with Talat Nishenli, published a study in 2017 in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, proposing that the carved imagery on the pillars of enclosure D encodes an astronomical event, specifically a comet strike or airburst of the kind associated with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The central pillar of enclosure D, known as Pillar 43 or the vulture stone, carries a distinctive arrangement of carved animals: a vulture, a scorpion, a circle interpreted as the sun or a comet, and other figures that Sweatman initially argue corresponds to the positions of specific star constellations as they appeared on the horizon at the time of the proposed Younger Dryas impact, approximately 12,900 years ago. If this interpretation is correct, and it is contested, as all interpretations of ancient symbolic systems must be, then Göbekli Tepe is not just a record of astronomical observation. It is a memorial, a monument built to commemorate a catastrophe. A warning, perhaps, carved in stone by people who had survived something terrible and wanted to record it for future generations. The animals carved on the pillars, the vulture, the scorpion, the fox, would correspond to the constellations visible at the time of the catastrophe. The symbols would encode the date, the nature, and perhaps the meaning of the event in a format designed to survive the ravages of time. Think about what that implies. It implies that the people who built Göbekli Tepe not only had sophisticated astronomical knowledge of star positions, of constellations, of the relationship between sky and time, but that they had experienced something so terrible, so civilization-altering, that they felt compelled to memorialize it in permanent stone. And that they had the organizational capacity, the technical skill, and the cultural motivation to build monuments on a scale that would survive for millennia. This is not the behavior of simple hunter-gatherers. This is the behavior of a sophisticated society with a rich tradition, a historical consciousness, and a desire to communicate across time. It is the behavior of people who understood that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations can fall, that memory can be lost, and who took deliberate steps to preserve what they knew in a form that could outlast them. Where did they get this knowledge? If the Younger Dryas impact occurred approximately 12,900 years ago, and Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 11,600 years ago, then a period of roughly 1,300 years separates the catastrophe from the monument. 1,300 years of surviving, of rebuilding, of maintaining a tradition of astronomical knowledge through whatever dark period followed the catastrophe. 1,300 years of oral tradition, perhaps preserving the memory of what the sky looked like on the night the world changed. Or perhaps the knowledge was older still. Perhaps the astronomical understanding encoded at Göbekli Tepe predated even the Younger Dryas event. Perhaps it was part of the intellectual heritage of the very civilization that was struck and damaged by that event. The people who built Göbekli Tepe on this reading were not starting from scratch. They were survivors or the descendants of survivors, preserving and transmitting knowledge from a world that had been partially destroyed. They were building not a beginning but a memorial to an ending. This is a hypothesis, a compelling, evidence-supported hypothesis, but a hypothesis. What is not a hypothesis is the sophistication of the astronomical knowledge embedded at Göbekli Tepe, the antiquity of the site, and the fact that its existence requires us to push back our understanding of when sophisticated human civilization began by several thousand years at minimum. Göbekli Tepe is not alone in its astronomical sophistication. Across the world, in cultures separated by vast distances and vast spans of time, ancient monuments encode precise astronomical knowledge in their orientations, their proportions, and their placement in the landscape. And in many cases, the specific astronomical knowledge encoded in these monuments goes far beyond what we would expect from the cultures to which they are attributed. Let us consider Stonehenge. Not as the overexposed tourist attraction it has become, the image of those standing stones is so familiar that it has almost lost its power to astonish, but as an engineering and astronomical achievement. Because taken seriously, on its own terms, Stonehenge is a remarkable thing. The monument that most visitors see today is what remains of a structure built in multiple phases over a period of roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 3000 BCE to 1500 BCE. The most dramatic phase, the one that created the Great Sarsen Stone Circle and the trilithon horseshoe that defines the monument's iconic silhouette, dates to approximately 2500 BCE. The Sarsen stones, the large gray sandstone blocks, come from Marlborough Downs, approximately 25 miles to the north. The blue stones, the smaller inner circle of volcanic rock, come from the Preseli Hills in Wales, approximately 200 miles away. Moving stones of these sizes, the largest sarsens weigh approximately 25 tons, the lintels that sit atop them requiring precise joints called mortise and tenon. Over these distances, without wheeled vehicles or draft animals in the conventional sense, is a significant engineering challenge. But the engineering, impressive as it is secondary to the astronomical purpose. Stonehenge is oriented to the sunrise on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. On that morning, the sun rises precisely over the heel stone, a large outlying stone positioned to the northeast, and its light penetrates into the heart of the monument along the central axis. This orientation is precise and deliberate. The builders knew exactly where the sun rose on the solstice, and they aligned their monument to that point with a care that required careful astronomical observation over multiple years. But Stonehenge encodes more than the solstice alignment. Researcher Gerald Hawkins demonstrated in the 1960s that various alignments within the monument correspond to the rising and setting points of the sun and moon at significant moments in the annual and lunar cycles, the equinoxes, the lunar standstills, the points of maximum and minimum moonrise on the horizon. Hawkins argued that Stonehenge was, among other things, an eclipse predictor, a mechanical computer made of stone that could be used, by moving markers around the ring of 56 Aubrey holes that circle the monument, to predict the roughly 18-year cycle of lunar eclipses. Whether every detail of Hawkins' analysis is correct has been debated. But the fundamental point that Stonehenge embeds precise astronomical knowledge in its design, and that this knowledge is more sophisticated than we casually attribute to Bronze Age Britons, is well established. The builders of Stonehenge were careful, systematic astronomical observers who understood the long cycles of the sky and encoded that understanding in stone. And Stonehenge is just one example. Newgrange in Ireland, built approximately 5,200 years ago, is oriented to the sunrise on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, with such precision that on that morning, a narrow beam of sunlight penetrates a specially designed roof box above the entrance and illuminates the interior of the passage for exactly 17 minutes, then retreats. This effect works only on the winter solstice and the few days immediately surrounding it, and achieving it required precise knowledge of the sun's position at that specific time of year, and the ability to translate that knowledge into the architectural alignment of a stone passage tomb with sub-degree accuracy. The Great Pyramid of Giza is oriented to true north with an accuracy of approximately 0.05 degrees, better than the Greenwich Observatory building, which was constructed in 1675 CE specifically to be astronomically aligned. How the ancient Egyptians achieved this level of alignment without magnetic compasses and without modern surveying instruments is a genuine puzzle. Various explanations have been proposed: stellar alignment using circumpolar stars, solar alignment using the equinox, and none of them has been definitively proven. What is undeniable is the result: an alignment to true north of extraordinary precision, achieved thousands of years ago by people who, by our conventional understanding, should not have had the tools to do it. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, built in the 12th century of the Common Era, is oriented to the west, the direction of the setting sun, appropriate to its function as a royal mausoleum, but its precise alignment relative to the horizon also corresponds to the sunrise on the spring equinox. The temple's towers, seen from the main entrance on the spring equinox, appear to be arranged so that the sun rises directly over the central tower. The proportions of the temple complex, when analyzed carefully, encode astronomical cycles including the lunar cycle, the solar year, and longer astronomical periods related to precession. Chichen Itza in the Yucatan contains the pyramid known as El Castillo, which produces one of the most dramatic astronomical displays in the ancient world. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, the afternoon sun creates a pattern of light and shadow on the northern staircase of the pyramid that produces the visual effect of a serpent descending from the temple at the pyramid's top to the earth below. A serpent whose body is formed by the triangular shadows of the pyramid's stepped tiers, connecting to the carved stone serpent heads at the base of the staircase. The effect lasts for approximately 3.5 hours and would be invisible if the pyramid were oriented even slightly differently. It is not an accident. It is an intentional design feature, encoding the relationship between the equinox, the sun, and the feathered serpent deity Kukulkan in a form that would be dramatically visible to anyone present on those specific days. These are not coincidences. Across the ancient world, in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, monuments encode precise astronomical knowledge with a sophistication and intentionality that is unmistakable. The question is where this knowledge came from. Did each culture develop it independently? Or is there, as some researchers argue, a common source, a tradition of astronomical knowledge, perhaps originating in the deep past, that was transmitted across cultures and that found expression in the orientation and design of their most important monuments? The independent development hypothesis is the conventional one, and it has much to recommend it. Careful astronomical observation, maintained over generations, can produce sophisticated astronomical knowledge. People everywhere look at the sky, and people everywhere notice patterns, but the question of degree matters. The level of precision achieved at the Great Pyramid, at Newgrange, at Stonehenge, at Angkor Wat, this is not the level of precision that comes from casual observation. This is the product of systematic, long-term, intergenerational observational programs, combined with the mathematical and engineering capability to translate observations into architectural reality. And the consistency of certain specific astronomical focuses across widely separated cultures, the solstices and equinoxes, the Pleiades, the movements of Venus, the cycle of precession, this consistency suggests at minimum a common set of questions being asked, perhaps even a common tradition of answers. Among the astronomical features most commonly encoded in ancient monuments worldwide, the cycle of precession holds a special place. We mentioned precession briefly in Part 1, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis over a cycle of approximately 25,920 years, which causes the positions of stars relative to specific horizon points to shift gradually over time. It is this phenomenon that causes the identity of the pole star to change over long periods. Polaris is our current pole star, but 5,000 years ago it was Thuban, and in 12,000 years it will be Vega. It is also this phenomenon that causes the zodiacal constellations to shift against the equinox points over the great precessional cycle, the phenomenon often called the precession of the equinoxes. The conventional attribution of the discovery of precession to Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE is well established in the history of science. But researchers including Hamlet's Mill authors Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von de Chend, as well as Graham Hancock and others, have argued that knowledge of precession is encoded in ancient myths, sacred number systems, and architectural proportions that predate Hipparchus by thousands of years. Not just by a few centuries, but by millennia. The argument is mathematical. The precessional cycle covers approximately 25,920 years. In 1 degree of precessional movement, the smallest meaningful unit of the cycle, approximately 72 years pass. 72 years is a number that appears with remarkable frequency in sacred traditions worldwide, in Egyptian mythology, in Vedic astronomy, in Norse mythology, in Mesoamerican calendar systems. The number 360, fundamental to our division of the circle, multiplied by 72 gives 25,920, the length of the full precessional cycle. The number 2,160, the number of years for the equinox to move through one zodiacal sign, appears in Babylonian astronomical texts and in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. The number 12, the number of zodiacal signs, appears in the mythological traditions of virtually every ancient culture. De Santillana and von de Chend argued in their dense, brilliant, and often maddening 1969 book Hamlet's Mill that ancient myths worldwide, including the myth of Hamlet itself and its Norse counterpart Amlodhi, are encoded descriptions of precessional astronomy. That the imagery of millstones grinding, of great world ages ending and beginning, of gods and heroes moving through the heavens, is the mythological language in which ancient astronomers recorded and transmitted their knowledge of the precessional cycle. If they are right, and their argument, while complex and not universally accepted, has never been definitively refuted, then knowledge of precession was widespread in the ancient world long before Hipparchus. It was embedded in myth, in sacred number, in architectural proportion, and in the orientations of monuments. And tracking precession, watching the slow drift of the equinox point against the background of fixed stars, requires astronomical observation sustained over centuries or millennia. It requires records. It requires a tradition of systematic sky watching maintained across many human generations. Where did that tradition begin? When? And who maintained it through the dark period of the Younger Dryas, when whatever civilization had developed the knowledge was presumably partially or wholly destroyed? These are questions without definitive answers, but they are the right questions, and the fact that precessional numbers appear with remarkable consistency in the sacred traditions and architectural proportions of ancient cultures worldwide, cultures that were not in direct historical contact, is a fact that demands explanation. Let us now turn to a body of evidence that is often discussed in popular treatments of ancient mysteries, but less often analyzed with the rigor it deserves: the mythological record. The ancient stories of floods, of destroyed civilizations, of gods who came from the sea or the sky bearing the gifts of civilization. What do these traditions actually tell us, and how seriously should we take them as historical sources? The flood myth is one of the most widespread narrative traditions in the world. It appears in some form in the mythological traditions of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, India, China, Mesoamerica, South America, the Pacific Islands, Australia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, in virtually every major cultural tradition on Earth. The details vary, but the core elements are remarkably consistent. A great flood that destroys most of humanity, a small group of survivors who preserve the seeds of civilization, a new world built on the ruins of the old. The most famous version in the Western tradition is the story of Noah from the Hebrew Bible, a story that is itself closely related to, and possibly derived from, the much older Babylonian flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood survivor is called Utnapishtim. But the Sumerian tradition goes back even further to a text called the Eridu Genesis, where the flood survivor is Ziusudra. And the Indian tradition has Manu, the first human, warned by a fish to build a boat and survive a great flood. And the Greek tradition has Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived the flood sent by Zeus by floating in a chest. And the Mesoamerican traditions have multiple flood stories from cultures that had no contact with the Old World and therefore no opportunity to borrow the narrative from Mesopotamian sources. The universal distribution of the flood myth has been debated for centuries. Rationalists and skeptics argue that floods are common everywhere, that any agricultural civilization living near water will experience serious floods, and that the flood myth is therefore a near-universal human response to a near-universal human experience. This explanation has merit. Local floods are indeed a common and traumatic experience for agricultural societies, and the mythologization of serious local floods into cosmic narratives of world destruction is psychologically and culturally plausible. But this explanation becomes strained when confronted with the specific details of the flood narratives, because the flood myths do not simply describe big local floods, they describe a single, world-destroying event. They describe the destruction not just of crops and villages, but of entire civilizations. They describe survivors who preserve not just their lives but specific knowledge, seeds, animals, the arts of civilization. They describe a world fundamentally transformed by the flood, a before and an after, with the world after the flood being a diminished version of the world before it, a world in which something important has been lost. These specific details, the civilizational scale of the destruction, the deliberate preservation of knowledge, the sense of a lost golden age before the flood, are not what you would expect from a mythologization of local flooding events. They are what you would expect from cultural memory of a single, genuinely catastrophic global event. An event like the dramatic sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers raised sea levels by approximately 400 feet over a period of thousands of years, with some of that rise occurring in dramatic pulses, events called meltwater pulses, during which sea levels rose very rapidly. Or an event like the proposed Younger Dryas impact, which would have generated fires, floods, and climate disruption on a global scale. The connection between the geological record of late Pleistocene catastrophe and the mythological record of ancient flood traditions is not proven. Myths are cultural artifacts, subject to elaboration, adaptation, and the accretion of meaning over centuries of retelling. We cannot treat them as straightforward historical documents, but neither should we dismiss them entirely. In a world without writing, without archives, without the institutional memory that complex literate civilizations maintain, oral tradition was the primary mechanism for transmitting important knowledge across generations. and oral traditions when they describe specific events with specific details that correlate with independently established geological and archaeological data, deserve to be taken seriously as potentially encoding real historical memory. The Plato connection is particularly interesting in this context. Plato, the Greek philosopher writing in the 4th century BCE, included in 2 of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, an extended account of a legendary civilization called Atlantis. According to the story as Plato tells it, Atlantis was a great island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a powerful maritime civilization, technologically sophisticated and politically organized. And approximately 9,000 years before Plato's own time, which would place the event around 9,600 BCE, Atlantis sank beneath the ocean in a single day and night, destroyed by earthquake and flood. The story of Atlantis has attracted an enormous amount of attention and an enormous amount of credulous nonsense. Pseudo-archaeologists have placed Atlantis everywhere from the Caribbean to Antarctica to beneath the Sahara Desert. Sensational books have claimed to have found its ruins. None of these claims has ever been substantiated, and Plato himself may have been writing philosophical fiction, using the Atlantis story as a literary device to make political and philosophical points, not as a genuine historical account. But here is the interesting thing. Plato explicitly states that the Atlantis story was not his invention, that it came to the Athenians through the statesman Solon, who had received it from Egyptian priests at Sais during a visit to Egypt in the 6th century BCE. The priests, according to Plato's account, told Solon that the Greeks were children compared to the Egyptians in terms of historical memory, that the Greeks had suffered many catastrophes that had destroyed their historical records, but that the Egyptians had preserved records going back far longer. And among those records, the priests said, was the account of Atlantis and its destruction. Whether this is true, whether there was a genuine Egyptian tradition that Solon encountered, cannot now be determined. Plato may have invented the Egyptian source as a literary device to give his story authority. But if we take it at face value, if we entertain the possibility that Plato was faithfully transmitting something he received, however distorted by time and transmission, then what we have is a Greek philosopher preserving, from Egyptian sources, a memory of a maritime civilization destroyed by catastrophic flooding approximately 11,600 years ago. 11,600 years ago, the same date as the construction of Göbekli Tepe, the same date as the end of the Younger Dryas cold period, the same general timeframe as the proposed Younger Dryas impact event, the same period as the dramatic sea level rises associated with the end of the last ice age. Is this convergence of dates meaningful? Is it coincidence? Is it the echo of a real event, preserved across 11 millennia of human memory, surfacing in Plato's dialogues, in the construction of Göbekli Tepe, in the flood myths of cultures worldwide? We genuinely do not know, but we can say this: the convergence is striking, it demands attention, and it is the kind of convergence that, in any field of inquiry, would normally prompt serious investigation rather than dismissal. Now let us travel to a region that does not often appear in discussions of ancient mysteries, but which has recently produced discoveries that are genuinely extraordinary and that add yet another layer of complexity to the picture we have been building. The Sinai Peninsula, that triangular wedge of territory connecting Africa to Asia, bounded by the Red Sea to the west and the Gulf of Aqaba to the east, and dominated by the rugged granite mountains of its southern interior. The Sinai Peninsula has been inhabited and traveled through since the earliest periods of human history. It was the route by which peoples and armies moved between Egypt and the Levant, Africa and Asia, for thousands of years. It contains ancient turquoise and copper mines that the Egyptians exploited intensively from at least the Old Kingdom period onward. It contains some of the earliest alphabetic inscriptions known, the Proto-Sinaitic script found at the site of Serapeum el-Qadim, which may be the ancestor of all alphabetic writing systems. It is, of course, deeply significant in the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the setting of Moses' encounter with God and the giving of the law. But what is now emerging from the Sinai, through a combination of satellite imagery analysis, ground survey, and excavation, suggests that our understanding of the peninsula's ancient importance has been significantly understated. The site known as Tel Abu Sefe, sometimes identified with the ancient town of Tijaru, which served as the starting point of the military road the Egyptians called the Ways of Horus, their main route into the Levant, has long been known to archaeologists. But recent excavation work there has revealed the extent of the military fortification system at this site in a way that fundamentally changes our picture of Egyptian military architecture and strategic planning. What has been found at Tel Abu Sefe is not a simple frontier fort. It is the remains of an enormous military installation, one of the largest fortress complexes yet found from ancient Egypt. The outer enclosure walls, as revealed by excavation and geophysical survey, enclosed an area of remarkable size. Within these walls, archaeologists have found the remains of multiple building phases, suggesting that the site was occupied, expanded, and maintained over a very long period, from the New Kingdom period, around 1550 BCE, through the late period and into the period of Greco-Roman rule. For more than 1,000 years, this site served as Egypt's primary defensive and logistical base for operations into the Levant. The sheer scale of the investment, the labor required to build and maintain walls of this extent, the organizational complexity of supplying and staffing a garrison at this remote desert location, speaks to the strategic importance the Egyptians placed on controlling this corridor. The Sinai was not, in Egyptian strategic thinking, a wasteland to be crossed as quickly as possible. It was a territory to be managed, controlled, and used, and the military infrastructure they built to do so was of a scale and sophistication that commands respect. But the military discoveries, impressive as they are only part of the Sinai story, because there is another discovery in a different part of the peninsula that takes us in a quite different direction. A direction that speaks not to Egyptian military power, but to Egyptian environmental knowledge and engineering capability. The site, which researchers have been working to characterize in detail, contains what has been described as a green avenue, a remarkable feature that initially seems almost impossible in the context of the Sinai Desert, an avenue of ancient trees. Not a random scattering of desert vegetation, but a deliberately planted, deliberately maintained alignment of trees extending for a significant distance through terrain that today is almost devoid of plant life. The significance of this is difficult to overstate. The Sinai Peninsula today receives very little rainfall in most areas, less than 50 millimeters per year. It is, by any standard, desert. The idea that ancient Egyptians deliberately planted and maintained an avenue of trees in this environment suggests a level of environmental engineering, of water management, of horticultural knowledge, of logistical commitment to maintaining vegetation in a harsh environment that goes well beyond what we have typically attributed to ancient Egyptian activity in the Sinai. But the evidence is there. The root systems of the ancient trees, preserved in the desert conditions that so effectively protect organic remains, have been identified at regular intervals along the alignment. The pattern is clearly artificial. These were not trees that grew naturally in this spot. They were planted at regular intervals along a deliberate route. And they must have been watered somehow, through some system of water management that has not yet been fully characterized, in order to survive in an environment that would normally not support them. What was this avenue for? The most obvious possibility is that it served as a ceremonial road, a processional way connecting important sites, its shaded avenue providing protection from the brutal Sinai sun for travelers, priests, or soldiers moving between military installations or religious sites. The Egyptians were fond of ceremonial avenues. Think of the avenue of sphinxes at Karnak, the dromos of various temples, and this Sinai feature, may represent the same impulse applied in a desert military and logistical context. But the engineering required to create and maintain it is what truly impresses. To plant trees in the Sinai and keep them alive requires, at minimum, a reliable water supply, probably from wells, possibly from some form of water harvesting infrastructure that collected and stored the occasional desert rainfall. It requires knowledge of which species can survive in desert conditions with minimal water. It requires a logistical commitment to maintaining the watering regime over the lifetime of the trees, which, for the species likely used, could be decades or centuries. And it requires an organizational structure capable of sustaining all of this over long time periods. This is environmental engineering, not in a casual or accidental sense, but in a deliberate, knowledgeable, sustained sense. The ancient Egyptians who created this green avenue understood desert ecology and desert water management in ways that allowed them to do something that most people today would consider barely possible, let alone something that ancient peoples could achieve. And this fits with a broader picture of Egyptian knowledge that LiDAR surveys and other recent analyses are beginning to reveal. The ancient Egyptians were not simply pyramid builders and monument erectors. They were sophisticated managers of their environment, engineers who understood the Nile flood cycle with extraordinary precision, who built irrigation systems capable of sustaining agriculture in a desert, who managed the agricultural potential of the Nile Valley with a consistency and productivity that fed one of the ancient world's largest populations for thousands of years. The Green Avenue of the Sinai is not an anomaly within this picture. It is an extension of it, an application of Egyptian environmental knowledge to a new and challenging terrain. But it raises a question that the conventional history of Egypt does not quite answer. Where did this knowledge come from? Egyptian civilization did not spring into being fully formed. There were predecessors, the pre-dynastic cultures that preceded the unification of Egypt around 3100 BCE. But those predecessors, as far as we can tell from the conventional archaeological record, were not as sophisticated as the civilization that suddenly appeared at the beginning of the dynastic period. The transition from pre-dynastic to dynastic Egypt is, in the assessment of many researchers, almost startlingly abrupt. Complex writing, monumental architecture, sophisticated administration, advanced engineering, these things appear in the Egyptian record with a suddenness that has long puzzled researchers. Was there a longer developmental sequence that we have not yet found? Was there a tradition of knowledge, perhaps the same tradition that produced the astronomical sophistication of Göbekli Tepe, the engineering capability that built the Baalbek platform, the precision techniques that appear in the Serapeum sarcophagi that the Egyptians inherited and built upon? Were they, like so many other ancient civilizations, building on a foundation laid by something older? This brings us to a concept that has become increasingly central to serious discussion of ancient history over the past decade, the idea of the black mat and what lies above and below it. The black mat is a geological marker, a thin, dark layer of material found at sites across the American continent and at some European sites that corresponds to the Younger Dryas boundary, the moment of catastrophic change approximately 12,900 years ago. Below the black mat, Clovis period artifacts, mammoth bones, the remains of the megafauna that went extinct at the boundary. Above the black mat, none of these things, a clear, sharp break in the archaeological and biological record. This break is what has driven the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Because the cleanness of the break, the abruptness with which Clovis artifacts and megafauna disappear from the record at the same geological moment, is hard to explain by gradual climate change alone. Gradual climate change produces gradual transitions in the archaeological and biological record. The black mat produces an abrupt one, and here's what matters for our story. The absence of sophisticated human remains below the black mat in the Americas does not mean that sophisticated human beings were not present in the Americas at that time. It means that whatever they left behind, their settlements, their artifacts, their infrastructure, has not been found. In a landscape swept by fire and flood, in coastal regions drowned by rising seas, in river valleys buried under meters of post-catastrophe sediment, the traces of a sophisticated society could easily be absent from the conventional archaeological record without that society never having existed. The drowned landscapes are particularly significant here. We mentioned briefly in Part 1 that sea levels at the end of the last ice age were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. This is not a small difference. It is a transformation of the world's coastlines that cannot be overstated. At the height of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, the continental shelves of the world, areas that are now under 200 or 300 feet of water, were dry land. Large areas of what is now the shallow seafloor were plains, forests, river valleys, and coastlines where people could have lived. In fact, research over the past 2 decades has established that the continental shelves were not marginal, inhospitable environments. The areas now submerged near the coasts of Britain, Scandinavia, Southeast Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and many other regions were, during the glacial maximum, rich, productive environments supporting dense vegetation and abundant wildlife. The now submerged shelf between Britain and continental Europe, sometimes called Doggerland, was a vast, low-lying landscape of river floodplains, marshes, and coastal areas that probably supported large human populations during the late glacial period. A similar story applies to the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, the Sahel Shelf connecting Australia to New Guinea and nearby islands, the Gulf of Mexico's expanded coastal plains. These areas are now underwater. And here's the crucial point: we have barely looked at them. The archaeology of the continental shelves, the underwater archaeology of the drowned post-glacial landscapes, is in its absolute infancy. The technology to conduct serious archaeological survey on the seafloor at depths of 50 to 300 feet over large areas has only recently become available. The political and logistical challenges of underwater survey and excavation are enormous. The resources devoted to it are tiny compared to the resources devoted to terrestrial archaeology. And yet the occasional glimpse we have gotten of what lies on the submerged shelves has been striking. Off the coast of India, at sites like Dwarka and Pumpuhar, archaeologists have found structural remains, what appear to be walls and platforms, at depths of up to 25 meters, suggesting human occupation of areas that were submerged by sea level rise following the end of the last ice age. Off the coast of Japan, at a site called Yonaguni, a large underwater structure consisting of flat-topped terraces, right angles, and what appear to be carved features has been found on the seafloor. Its interpretation is hotly contested. Some researchers see it as a natural geological formation, others as evidence of human construction. The debate has not been resolved. In the Persian Gulf, which was dry land for most of the last glacial maximum, and filled with water relatively rapidly as the ice age ended, there may be submerged remains of some of the earliest settled communities in the region, communities that preceded the Mesopotamian civilizations we know about. Some researchers have speculated that the Persian Gulf basin was, during the glacial maximum, a well-watered river valley of extraordinary fertility, a kind of primordial garden that was drowned by rising seas around 8,000 years ago, and whose memory may survive in the Mesopotamian flood traditions and possibly in the story of Eden. These are speculations. They are not proven. But they are grounded in real geology. The Persian Gulf really was dry land. It really was watered by rivers during the glacial period. It really was flooded by sea level rise, and the archaeological exploration of its submerged terrain has barely begun. What might be found there if serious resources were devoted to underwater survey and excavation is genuinely unknown. It could be nothing remarkable, or it could be something that changes the history of civilization. Let us now turn to the question of ancient maps. Because among the pieces of evidence that researchers like Graham Hancock have pointed to as suggestive of a lost civilization with advanced geographical knowledge, the so-called anomalous ancient maps occupy a significant place, and the most famous and most debated of these is the Piri-Reis map. The Piri-Reis map is a world map compiled in 1513 CE by an Ottoman admiral named Piri-Reis. Piri-Reis himself documented his sources. He stated that the map was compiled from a large number of source maps, including some that he claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. The map, which is preserved in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, shows the Atlantic Ocean with the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and most strikingly, the coastlines of the Americas and what has been interpreted as the coast of Antarctica. The claim that the Piri-Reis map shows Antarctica is the center of the controversy. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820 CE, more than 300 years after the Piri-Reis map was compiled. If the map shows Antarctica's coastline, it implies that someone had knowledge of that coastline before official Western discovery. And the argument goes further. The coastline shown on the map corresponds, in some interpretations, not to Antarctica's current coastline, which is covered by ice, but to its subglacial coastline, the coastline of the Antarctic continent as it would appear without its ice sheet. Since the ice sheet has been in place for millions of years, knowledge of the subglacial coastline would imply either geological knowledge we cannot explain or the existence of maps made at a time when Antarctica was ice-free, which in human evolutionary terms is essentially forever ago. This argument, most fully developed by Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, is fascinating and has attracted considerable attention. It has also attracted considerable skepticism. Modern cartographers and historians who have examined the Piri-Reis map carefully point out that the identification of the southern landmass as Antarctica is not definitive. It could represent a hypothetical southern continent that cartographers of the Renaissance commonly placed on maps to balance the known northern landmasses, or it could represent South America's southern tip distorted in the course of compilation from multiple source maps with different projections. The correspondence between the Piri-Reis map and Antarctica's subglacial coastline, while intriguing, is not precise enough to be conclusive. But the broader point, that ancient cartographic knowledge may have been more extensive than we think, and that certain source maps available to medieval and Renaissance cartographers may have derived ultimately from ancient originals of unknown provenance, is not absurd. Maps do not survive well. The Library of Alexandria burned. The libraries of Persepolis burned. Countless repositories of ancient knowledge have been lost to fire, to conquest, to the simple ravages of time. If an advanced ancient civilization maintained a cartographic tradition, that tradition's survival to the modern period would depend on a chain of transmission, copying, translation, preservation that would inevitably introduce errors and losses. What we might expect to find if such a tradition existed is exactly what we do find: fragmentary, imperfect, partially recognizable echoes of geographical knowledge in maps that are ostensibly recent compilations from older sources. Does that describe the Piri-Reis map? Possibly, not definitively, but the question is worth taking seriously. Now let us move to something more concrete, more measurable, more unambiguously remarkable. Let us talk about the mathematics of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Because whatever one believes about lost civilizations and ancient wisdom traditions, the mathematical properties of the Great Pyramid are physically real, objectively measurable, and deeply surprising. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BCE as the accepted date, is the oldest and largest of the three pyramids at Giza and is the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. It was, for approximately 3,800 years, the tallest structure on Earth. Its base covers an area of approximately 13 acres. It is composed of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks weighing an average of 2.5 to 15 tons each, with some stones in the internal structure weighing up to 80 tons. The precision of its construction is, by any standard, extraordinary. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter extent, and the four sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with the accuracy we mentioned earlier of approximately 0.05 degrees. But it is the mathematical relationships encoded in the pyramid's dimensions that have fascinated researchers for centuries. Let us go through some of them. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height, when calculated using the pyramid's original dimensions, yields the value of 2 pi to a high degree of accuracy. Specifically, the perimeter of the base divided by twice the height gives approximately 3.14159, the value of pi to 5 significant figures. This relationship is not a rough approximation. It is precise enough that researchers from Flinders Petrie in the 19th century to modern analysts have confirmed it repeatedly. Whether this pi relationship was intentional, whether the architects of the Great Pyramid deliberately encoded pi in their dimensions, or whether it is a consequence of some other design principle, such as the use of a rolling drum to measure distances, which would naturally introduce pi through the relationship between circumference and diameter, has been debated. But the relationship is real and it is precise. The height of the Great Pyramid, when multiplied by a factor of 43,200, gives approximately the polar radius of the Earth to within 0.5%. The perimeter of the base, multiplied by the same factor of 43,200, gives approximately the equatorial circumference of the Earth to within 0.1%. The factor 43,200 is itself significant. It is 600 times 72, and 72, as we mentioned earlier, is the number of years required for the equinox to precess through 1 degree. In other words, the Great Pyramid appears to encode the dimensions of the Earth, using a scale factor that is itself derived from the precessional cycle. This is remarkable. To encode the dimensions of the Earth in the proportions of a monument, you need to know the dimensions of the Earth with considerable accuracy. The conventional history of geodesy, the science of measuring the Earth, gives credit for the first accurate measurement of the Earth's circumference to Eratosthenes of Cyrene, working around 240 BCE. But if the Great Pyramid encodes the Earth's dimensions with the accuracy claimed by researchers who have analyzed it carefully, then whoever designed the pyramid knew those dimensions to comparable accuracy more than 2,000 years before Eratosthenes. How? The honest answer is that we do not know. The mainstream response is to question whether the relationships are really as precise as claimed, or whether they arise from chance or from the properties of certain simple geometric constructions that could be made without knowledge of geodesy. These are legitimate points, and they have been carefully addressed by researchers on both sides of the debate. The precision of the relationships has been confirmed by multiple independent analyses. Whether they are intentional rather than coincidental is a matter of interpretation. But the precision is real, and then there is the geographical relationship. The Great Pyramid is located at approximately 30 degrees north latitude, a location that from a purely geometrical standpoint is exactly 1/3 of the way from the equator to the North Pole. From this location it sits close to the center of the world's landmass. The longitude of Giza, 31 degrees east, passes through more land and less ocean than almost any other longitude on Earth. This positioning, if intentional, would require a knowledge of world geography, of the distribution of landmasses across the globe, that the Egyptians of 2560 BCE are not conventionally thought to have possessed. Again, coincidence or intention, the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. But the accumulation of these mathematical relationships, pi, the dimensions of the Earth, the precessional factor, the geodetically significant location, is not easy to dismiss as coincidence. The probability that all of these relationships arise by chance in a single structure seems, intuitively, very low, and low probability coincidences demand explanation. From the Great Pyramid, let us return one more time to the Amazon, but to a different aspect of the Amazon story than we have considered so far. We have talked about the cities, the causeways, the agricultural systems. Now let us talk about the people themselves. About what the indigenous inhabitants of the Amazon were doing at a much deeper level than city building, at the level of plant knowledge, of ecological management, of the relationship between human beings and the living world that sustained them. Because one of the most extraordinary aspects of Amazonian civilization, one that LiDAR cannot reveal, but that ethnobotanical research and careful anthropological work are beginning to document, is the depth and sophistication of indigenous knowledge of the Amazon's plant life. This knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of intimate relationship with one of the most biodiverse environments on Earth, represents a form of intellectual achievement that is every bit as impressive as the architectural achievements we have been discussing. Arguably more impressive, because it required not just engineering skill, but a quality of attentive, patient observation of the natural world that is almost impossible to fully appreciate from the outside. The Amazon basin contains approximately 40,000 plant species. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon have developed, over their long history in the region, medicinal and practical uses for a remarkable proportion of these species. The knowledge of which plants treat which conditions, how they are prepared, what dosages are effective, what combinations are beneficial, and what combinations are dangerous. This is a pharmacopoeia of extraordinary depth, developed through thousands of years of empirical research. Research conducted without laboratories, without controlled trials, without the institutional framework of modern medicine, but research nonetheless. Patient, careful, observational research transmitted through generations of specialists, producing a body of knowledge that modern pharmaceutical companies have only begun to explore, and that has already yielded numerous important modern drugs, including the muscle-relaxant curare, the antimalarial quinine, the anesthetic cocaine, and many others. But the most extraordinary example of Amazonian plant knowledge is something that has fascinated researchers since it first came to Western attention, the psychoactive brew known as ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is made by combining two plant ingredients, the vine Banisteriopsis caupi, which contains harmala alkaloids called MAOIs, and the leaves of Psychotria viridis, which contain the powerful psychedelic compound dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. Neither ingredient is psychoactive on its own in the way that the combination is. Psychotria viridis leaves, if consumed alone, produce no significant effect because DMT is rapidly broken down by monoamine oxidase enzymes in the human gut before it can reach the brain. Banisteriopsis caupi's MAOI compounds inhibit those enzymes, allowing the DMT to reach the brain and produce its effects. The preparation of ayahuasca thus requires the combination of two specific plants from an environment containing tens of thousands of plant species, plants whose combined effect depends on a specific biochemical interaction that requires knowledge of both the individual plants and the mechanism of their interaction. How indigenous Amazonian peoples discovered this combination, how they knew to combine these specific two plants among tens of thousands of possibilities, is a question that has no fully satisfying conventional answer. The conventional ethnobotanical explanation invokes trial and error over long time periods. Indigenous peoples were extremely knowledgeable about their plant environment and may have tried many combinations before discovering effective ones. This is plausible, but the sheer specificity of the ayahuasca combination, the precise biochemical relationship required, makes the pure trial and error explanation seem insufficient. The probability of stumbling upon exactly this combination by random experimentation in an environment with tens of thousands of alternatives is not zero, but it is very low. Indigenous informants, when asked how they discovered ayahuasca, typically give an answer that Western researchers find both beautiful and frustrating. The plants themselves told them. The plants communicated their properties and their combinations in visionary states. Whatever one makes of this explanation in literal terms, it points toward a relationship between indigenous peoples and their plant environment that is qualitatively different from the purely empirical, external relationship that the conventional trial and error explanation implies. It suggests an intimacy of knowledge, an attentiveness of observation, and perhaps a framework of understanding the living world that enabled insights that our more distanced, analytical approach would struggle to replicate. This is another form of the same mystery we have been encountering throughout this documentary. Ancient peoples knew things about plants, about stone, about stars, about the earth, that we struggle to explain by reference to the technologies and methods we attribute to them. The gap between what they knew and what we think they could have known is consistently, persistently, surprisingly wide. As we move toward the conclusion of this extraordinary journey through the ancient world, let us try to synthesize what we have found. Not to reach a definitive conclusion, the evidence does not permit that, but to identify the patterns, the threads that run through all of these disparate discoveries and mysteries and anomalies. The questions that they collectively raise and that they collectively refuse to let rest. Thread 1. The ancient world was far more complex, far more interconnected, and far more sophisticated than our conventional history has acknowledged. From the LiDAR revealed cities of the Amazon to the astronomical precision of Göbekli Tepe, from the engineering of Baalbek to the plant knowledge of indigenous Amazonian peoples, the evidence consistently shows us a deep human past of greater capability and organization than we have assumed. Every time we look carefully, with LiDAR, with ancient DNA, with precision measurement, with geological analysis, we find more than we expected. More cities, more people, more knowledge, more sophistication. Thread 2, there was a catastrophe. Approximately 12,900 years ago, the world changed dramatically. The climate shifted abruptly. The megafauna went extinct. Sea levels began their long rise, drowning the continental shelves. The Clovis people of the Americas disappeared from the archaeological record. And whether or not a cosmic impact was the primary cause of all of this, the debate continues. The geological and biological evidence for a major, rapid, global disruption at this period is well established. Whatever civilization or civilizations existed before this catastrophe would have been profoundly affected by it. Thread 3, something was preserved. Across the world, in the oldest known human monuments, Göbekli Tepe foremost among them, we find evidence of sophisticated knowledge that was apparently already mature at the time these monuments were built. Astronomical knowledge, mathematical knowledge, engineering knowledge. The sophistication does not build up gradually from a simple beginning in the archaeological record we can see. It appears seemingly fully formed in the oldest monuments we know. This is consistent with, though not proof of, the hypothesis that this knowledge was not newly developed but inherited, preserved from a tradition that predated the catastrophe. Thread 4, the ocean hides the evidence. The most likely locations for sophisticated pre-catastrophe settlements were coastal, near water, in the productive, resource-rich environments of river deltas and coastal plains that have always attracted human habitation. These areas are now underwater. The 400-foot rise in sea levels since the glacial maximum has drowned an area of the world's landmass roughly equivalent to the continent of Africa. Whatever was built in those drowned lands is now on the seafloor, and we have barely looked at it. Thread 5, our assumptions have been wrong before, and they may be wrong again. The history of archaeology is littered with confident consensus positions that turned out to be wrong. The Amazon was thought to be incapable of supporting complex civilization. LiDAR proved that wrong. The Maya were thought to be dispersed and relatively sparse in their urbanism. LiDAR proved that wrong. The peopling of the Americas was thought to be a relatively recent event via a single route. Ancient DNA has proved that wrong, or at least heavily complicated it. The implication is clear. We should hold our current certainties somewhat less tightly than we have tended to do. These 5 threads together do not prove the existence of a lost civilization. They do not prove that Atlantis was real, or that there were pre-human intelligence inhabitants of Earth, or any of the more dramatic claims that circulate in popular culture. What they prove, what the evidence firmly establishes, is that our picture of the deep human past is incomplete, that there are gaps in our knowledge that are larger than we have admitted. That the tools we now have, LiDAR, ancient DNA, underwater archaeology, geological analysis, are beginning to fill some of those gaps, and that what they are revealing is consistently more surprising, more complex, and more extraordinary than what we expected to find. There is one final thread to pull, and it may be the most important of all. It is the thread of intentionality, the thread that asks not just what ancient peoples built and knew, but what they were trying to do. What they were trying to say, what they were trying to preserve, because when you look at Göbekli Tepe, deliberately buried under thousands of tons of fill at some point, as if its builders wanted to protect it from whatever came next, and you think about the astronomical catastrophe that the carvings on its pillars may be recording, something comes into focus. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not just building for their own generation, they were building for the future. They were making something meant to last, something meant to be found, something that encoded in durable stone the most important knowledge they possessed. And when you look at the mathematical precision of the Great Pyramid encoding the dimensions of the Earth, encoding the precessional cycle, oriented to true north with modern surveying accuracy, you encounter the same quality. A message built in stone, addressed to whoever would come along with the intelligence and the instruments to read it. A message that says, we knew these things, we knew the shape of the earth, we knew the cycle of the sky, we were here and we understood the world. And when you look at the Serapeum sarcophagi with their machining tolerances that exceed conventional expectation by orders of magnitude, are those just incidental side effects of craftsmanship pride, or are they, too, a kind of message? A demonstration of capability, preserved in granite that will outlast any organic material, in an underground chamber protected from the elements by rock and desert aridity. Ancient peoples built for eternity. They chose the most durable materials available to them. They placed their monuments in positions of maximum visibility and permanence. They encoded their most important knowledge, astronomical, mathematical, geographical, in forms that would survive the ravages of time. It is as if they knew or feared that time would be very hard on their civilization, as if they were building archives, not just monuments, libraries of stone addressed to an uncertain future. If there was a civilization before the catastrophe, before the Younger Dryas, before the great floods, before the ice age ended and the seas rose, then its survivors would have faced exactly this challenge. How do you preserve what you know when everything you have built is being destroyed? When your cities are burning, when the seas are rising, when the very landscape is changing beyond recognition, you build in stone. You orient your monuments to the unchanging patterns of the sky, because the sky will always be there to confirm your measurements. You encode your mathematics in the proportions of your structures, because mathematics is the one language that will mean the same thing to any future civilization intelligent enough to measure and calculate. This is a hypothesis. But it is a hypothesis that fits the evidence with remarkable consistency. And it is a hypothesis that, as LiDAR and genetic analysis and geological research continue to fill in the blank spaces of the deep human past, is becoming harder and harder to dismiss as pure fantasy. We began this documentary with a simple observation. Somewhere beneath the endless green ceiling of the Amazon jungle, there are cities. We have covered 2 hours of evidence, from Bolivia to the Yucatan, from Lebanon to Egypt, from the highlands of Turkey to the flooded plains of the Sinai, from the drowned continental shelves to the highest mountains of the Andes, and everywhere we have looked, we have found the same thing. We have found more than we expected. We have found evidence of greater sophistication, greater complexity, greater antiquity, and greater mystery than the conventional history of human civilization has prepared us for. The cities of the Amazon are real. The precision of the Serapeum is real. The astronomical knowledge at Göbekli Tepe is real. The engineering of Baalbek is real. The mathematical relationships in the Great Pyramid are real. The cosmic catastrophe at the Younger Dryas boundary is increasingly supported by real scientific evidence. The drowned landscapes of the continental shelves are real and largely unexplored. The flood myths are universal and consistent in ways that pure coincidence does not adequately explain. None of this, taken individually, proves that a lost civilization existed before the end of the last ice age, but taken together, held in view simultaneously, connected by the threads we have identified, they paint a picture of a human past far richer, far deeper, and far more extraordinary than we have been taught. They point toward gaps in our knowledge that are enormous, and they suggest that what fills those gaps, when we finally develop the tools and the will to look carefully, will be among the most important discoveries in the history of human self-understanding. Percy Fawcett died in the jungle looking for a city that, as LiDAR has now revealed, was real. The ancient Egyptians grew trees in the Sinai desert through engineering techniques we are only beginning to appreciate. The Maya built a road network through the jungle that we could not see until lasers stripped the canopy away. The builders of Göbekli Tepe carved the sky into stone 11,600 years ago and then buried their creation, as if wrapping a message in the most durable envelope imaginable, waiting for someone to dig it up. We are digging it up, slowly, imperfectly, with tools that are getting better every year. And what we are finding, piece by piece, is the outline of a story so large and so old and so strange that we are only now beginning to find the words for it. The jungle is giving up its secrets. The desert sands are yielding their buried structures. The ocean is waiting, holding the greatest archive of all beneath its waves, patient as stone. And the sky, the ancient, permanent, mathematical sky that the builders of Göbekli Tepe and the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge and Angkor Wat all looked to and encoded in their monuments. The sky continues to turn as it has always turned, tracing the great processional circle that the ancients understood and that we are only now rediscovering that they understood. We are not alone in time. Behind us stretches a human past of extraordinary depth and complexity, one that we have barely begun to explore. The question is not whether our ancestors were capable of remarkable things. The evidence proves that they were. The question is how remarkable and how far back the capability goes and what was lost in the catastrophes that punctuate the geological record of this planet's human occupation. The search continues. The technology is improving. The questions are getting sharper and more precise, and the answers, the real answers, the ones that will finally illuminate the full scope of the human story on this remarkable planet, are closer now than they have ever been. The hidden world beneath the canopy is being revealed. What lies beneath the ocean, beneath the desert, beneath the ice, beneath the accumulated layers of our own confident assumptions about who we are and where we come from, that revelation is still ahead of us. And it will be extraordinary. This has been the hidden world beneath the canopy, ancient civilizations, lost cities, and the secrets LiDAR is revealing, the complete two-part documentary. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the deepest mysteries of the ancient world. If this documentary has made you think, has raised questions you want to explore further, has connected dots you had not seen connected before, please share it with someone who would feel the same way. Leave us a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We read every one of them, and the geography of this community never stops astonishing us. Subscribe to the channel because this is only the beginning. The discoveries keep coming. LiDAR is being deployed over new regions every month. Ancient DNA labs are processing samples that will rewrite chapters of human prehistory. Underwater archaeological surveys are beginning to look at the drowned continental shelves with new tools and new determination. Every month, the picture gets richer, the story gets deeper, and the mystery gets more beautiful. We will be here to cover it. We will see you in the next one.